Welcome to CozySideAudio, where every story pulls you deeper. If you like the thrill, the mystery, and the chase, like, share, and subscribe before the next clue disappears.
CozySideAudio presents Into the Dolomites. Chapter 1. Arrival Setup. The trailhead was quiet when Madison Hare arrived, her old sedan crunching over loose gravel as she pulled into the small parking lot tucked against the edge of the pines. The lot was nearly empty, save for a pair of dusty pickups and one weather-worn Subaru that looked like it belonged to a seasoned backpacker. The absence of cars reassured her in some ways. This wasn't going to be one of those overcrowded tourist trails where every overlook came with a dozen people holding up phones. But the stillness also reminded her that this was no city park. Out here, she would be alone. She shut off the engine and sat for a moment, hands still gripping the steering wheel, watching a bead of condensation slide down the windshield. The morning was cool, the kind of spring day that carried a promise of warmth later, but still crisp enough that her breath fogged faintly when she exhaled. The forest pressed close, trees crowding the sky with branches that shivered under a lazy breeze. This was what she had come for. Madison wasn't a seasoned adventurer. She wasn't an athlete or a mountaineer with stories about summits and glaciers. She was 28, a woman from a small Ohio town who had grown up with modest ambitions and even more modest confidence. A marketing job that felt like it belonged to someone else's life, not hers, filled most of her days. It paid the bills, but it left her restless in ways she couldn't name. She lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment with a view of the neighboring complex's dumpsters. Every week was the same. Emails, grocery runs, half-hearted exercise routines that never lasted more than a month. This trip, this day hike, was her attempt to break the cycle, if only for a weekend. She had read about the state park online, studied trail maps, cross-referenced weather forecasts. The photos of sheer cliffs, wildflower meadows, and hidden waterfalls had called to her. It had seemed accessible enough for someone with only a day pack and decent boots. A hike, not a journey. That was the intention. She opened her door, the hinges groaning faintly, and stepped out. The gravel shifted beneath her boots. The air smelled of pine resin and damp soil, grounding her in an instant. She slung her light pack over her shoulders. Water bottle, trail mix, a granola bar, a windbreaker, her phone, and a small paperback she had optimistically stuffed inside in case she found a sunny rock to sit on. Nothing more. Why would she bring more? She wasn't planning to be out after dark. The signboard at the trailhead displayed a faded map under scratched plexiglass. Colored lines wove through green ridges, dotted with markers for overlooks and campsites. Madison traced her intended path with her eyes. A loop of about 8 miles, with one section climbing toward a ridge before bending back toward the parking lot. Easy enough. She'd done longer walks in her neighborhood when she couldn't sleep. As she started up the trail, the forest closed in, the chatter of the outside world dropping away like a coat shrugged from her shoulders. The path was narrow but well-trodden, a soft bed of pine needles and packed earth. Birdsong laced through the air, delicate but insistent. The deeper she went, the more the trees seemed to stretch upward, as though the forest wanted to remind her of her size, her fragility. Madison adjusted her pack, shifting the strap where it pressed into her collarbone. Her steps fell into rhythm, the crunch of boots against earth, the rustle of brush as squirrels darted through undergrowth. After 20 minutes, she paused at a bend where sunlight pooled across the ground, turning ferns into little green lanterns. She tilted her head back, letting the warmth hit her face. It was easy to forget her office cubicle here. Easy to forget the dull weight of unanswered texts from friends who had drifted away, the pile of bills waiting on her kitchen counter, the mirror that sometimes showed her a woman she barely recognized. Out here, she wasn't defined by deadlines or the quiet ache of loneliness. Out here, she was simply a body moving through space, lungs pulling in clean air, eyes feasting on green. A jogger appeared briefly in the distance, a flash of neon shorts vanishing around the bend. Madison lifted a hand in half-hearted greeting, but the woman was gone before she could return it. Silence reclaimed the trail, leaving Madison with the sound of her own breathing. Hours stretched ahead of her. She thought about how she'd reward herself afterward. Maybe a hot meal in the nearest town. Maybe a long shower when she got back to her apartment. The thought made her smile. This day was meant to be hers. The trail began to climb, subtle at first, then steeper, winding its way along switchbacks. Madison slowed, her thighs burning, but she pressed on. At each turn, the trees seemed to thin a little, teasing glimpses of the sky. She crested a rise and was rewarded with her first real view, a valley unfurling below, stitched with a silver ribbon of river. In the distance, mountains loomed, their peaks smudged by a faint haze. She pulled her phone from her pocket, snapping a picture. The photo, as always, flattened the grandeur, turned the sweep of the world into something tame. She slipped it back into her pack, deciding she would rather hold the moment in her memory than on a screen. The wind was stronger up here, tugging at her hair, carrying the scent of wildflowers. She felt a thrill ripple through her chest, a reminder of why she had come. Not for the photo, not for something to post, for this, for the aliveness. She stood for a long moment, letting it sink in before turning back to the trail. The loop was waiting. The forest was waiting. And Madison Herr, in her quiet, uncertain way, was ready to meet it. Chapter 2. Trail Splits. The path had carried her comfortably for nearly 3 hours before it offered her a decision. Until then, the trail had been straightforward, winding steadily through the forest in gentle switchbacks, each turn giving way to another pocket of pine or a scatter of granite boulders. The air had grown warmer, heavy with the resinous sweetness of sun-baked needles. Her shirt clung damp against her back, but she hadn't minded. She had found her rhythm. Walk, pause for water, breathe in, breathe out. It was at the edge of a broad clearing that she noticed the divergence. The official trail was obvious, marked by a weathered post with a faded arrow and a splash of red paint. It curved left, leading toward higher ridges that, according to the map she'd studied, would eventually bend back into the loop and descend toward the car park. But to the right, almost obscured by tall grass and a collapse of old stones, there was another path, narrower, steeper, less defined. Madison squinted. At first she thought it might just be erosion or a deer track, but she could see faint boot prints in the dirt, a ghost of human passage. She shaded her eyes, peering ahead. The track seemed to dip between a notch of rocks before vanishing into a darker corridor of spruce. Her stomach fluttered. She unzipped the pocket of her pack, pulling out the folded paper map she'd picked up at the visitor center. She crouched, smoothing it across her knee. The bold line of the official trail was clear, looping back safely toward the starting point. The right-hand path, however, wasn't labeled at all. Not on this map, anyway. A memory stirred from the park's online forums, threads where hikers bragged about hidden gems and unofficial cut-throughs. She remembered scrolling late at night, half dreaming of freedom, half feeding her curiosity. Someone had mentioned a lesser-used spur that led to a dramatic overlook above the gorge. They described it as rough but rewarding, a place most visitors never saw. Her eyes lifted again to the unmarked trail. Could this be it? Madison chewed her lip. She had water, snacks, daylight. She wasn't in a rush. And wasn't this exactly why she had come? To do something different? To push a little beyond the ordinary? The thought of walking the sanctioned loop suddenly felt flat, predictable, safe. Her father's voice, from memory, whispered across the years, "It's the safe choices that keep you alive." She folded the map again, tucking it away. The right-hand path pulled at her like a dare. "Just for a little while," she murmured. The first steps were easy enough. The trail tilted down, grass brushing her calves, soil soft but stable underfoot. Sunlight fractured through the canopy, dappled patterns flickering across her arms. Birds rustled overhead, unseen but ever present. After 5 minutes, the sounds of the main trail faded. The trees pressed tighter, the air cooler in their shadow. The path sloped steeper, zigzagging around rocks and roots. Madison slowed her pace, leaning into her knees when she had to descend. Her thighs prickled with effort, but she relished it. The way her body reminded her it was capable, alive. The ground grew uneven, shifting from packed dirt to loose gravel. Her boots skidded once, sending a scatter of stones trickling downhill. She caught herself against a birch, breath puffing out in a nervous laugh. "This is fine," she told herself aloud, voice bouncing strangely in the confined space of the trees. The forest seemed older here, less touched. Moss coated the rocks in thick, velvety blankets. Fallen logs sprawled across the track, forcing her to swing her legs high or crouch beneath. The air smelled different, too, earthier, damp with the memory of recent rain. Every so often she wondered if she should turn back, but each time she pressed forward, drawn by the curiosity of what lay beyond the next bend. It wasn't recklessness, not exactly. More like momentum, that subtle push of wanting to see what she hadn't seen before. Half an hour later, she emerged into a clearing, and the sight stole her breath. Before her, the land fell away into a gorge so sudden and deep it seemed like the earth had split open. Walls of stone plunged into shadow, streaked with lichen and fractured with ledges where stubborn shrubs clung. The air here was different, cooler, touched with the faint metallic tang of water rushing far below. From her vantage, she could see the glint of a river twisting at the bottom, a silver thread weaving through darkness. Madison stepped closer, cautiously, until her boots nudged the edge of a rock slab. Her heart hammered. The drop was dizzying, easily 200 feet or more. She crouched low, palms pressed against the stone as though instinctively anchoring herself. This was why people came off trail. The view was raw, unfiltered, the kind of wildness that made you feel both infinite and microscopic. She felt a shiver ripple down her spine, not just of fear, but of awe. She slid her pack off one shoulder, fishing out her phone. The screen reflected her face first, flushed, strands of hair escaping her cap, eyes wide. She switched to the camera and tried to capture the gorge, but again, the photo fell flat. The depth was lost, the immensity clipped by the frame. With a sigh, she slipped the phone back. No one would see it the way she was seeing it now. No one else was here. That thought lingered. The silence pressed heavier, no longer the gentle hush of forest, but the oppressive weight of emptiness. Madison licked her lips. She told herself she'd turn back soon, rejoin the main trail before the light began to fade. But her eyes tracked a faint continuation of the spur, a scratch of path etched along the gorge's rim. It looked narrower, rougher, but it beckoned. She imagined the overlook the forum post had promised. Maybe just around the next corner. Maybe 10 more minutes. The breeze kicked up, pulling at her hair, whispering through the gorge like a warning. She tightened the straps of her pack, rolled her shoulders, and stepped forward onto the rim path. Chapter 3. The Fall. The rim path narrowed almost immediately. Madison slowed her steps, boots scuffing carefully along rock that crumbled beneath her weight. The trail wasn't really a trail anymore. It was more like a suggestion, a faint thread carved by others who had passed this way, then abandoned to erosion and time. On her left, the forest still pressed close, roots tangling across the soil where they could. On her right, the gorge yawned open, its sheer walls plunging into shadow. The contrast unnerved her. One misstep to the right, and she'd vanish. She tried not to think about it. Her breath grew shallow as she moved, the silence broken only by the crunch of loose gravel underfoot and the thrum of blood in her ears. She could feel sweat prick at her scalp, sliding down the curve of her neck. The sun was higher now, heating the rock, pulling moisture from the earth until the air smelled chalky and dry. She told herself to turn back. Just turn back, Madison. There's nothing here you can't live without. But each bend seemed to tease the promise of a better view, a glimpse of something just beyond. And there was a stubbornness in her, A quiet streak she'd never really tested, that refused to admit defeat to fear. Then it happened. The path dipped around a boulder, forcing her to step sideways, edging along a slanted rock ledge. She leaned slightly inward, pressing her palm to the stone wall for balance. Her boot shifted onto gravel. She felt the ground slip, a betrayal so fast she barely registered it before her weight lurched forward. "Wait!" Her voice cracked, swallowed by the gorge. The world tipped. Gravel skittered away under her boot, a cascade of pebbles rattling into the abyss. Madison's center of gravity pitched sideways, her arms flailing. For a split second she thought she could catch herself, thought she could grab the edge of the boulder. Her fingers brushed rough stone. Then she was falling. Her body struck once, hard, against the slope below. The impact punched the breath from her lungs. She tumbled, momentum dragging her down a spray of loose rocks. The world spun into chaos. Sky, stone, a flash of her own hands as she tried to claw at anything. A sickening crack tore through her awareness as her right leg struck against a jut of rock. White-hot pain exploded up her side. She screamed, but the sound was strangled, animal, lost in the plunge. Then another impact slammed her ribs. Her pack twisted around her shoulder, wrenching her neck. She rolled again, sliding, bouncing. Her mind fragmented into moments, stone slamming against skin, the taste of blood at the back of her throat, the sheer helplessness of a body no longer under its own command. At last, she slammed to a halt, wedged against a cluster of jagged rocks 10 feet down the slope. Dust clouded around her, grit sticking to the sweat on her face. The gorge fell away just a few feet beyond, an endless drop she had narrowly missed. She lay still, every nerve screaming. Her chest heaved, air dragging in ragged gasps. Her hands trembled violently against the stone, fingers scrabbling at nothing. The pain in her leg pulsed, sharp and nauseating, unlike anything she had ever felt. Her stomach lurched and she gagged, bile burning her throat. For a long moment she couldn't think, couldn't do anything but drown in the raw fact of it. She had fallen. She was broken, and no one knew she was here. Tears blurred her vision. She let out a low, desperate sob, pressing her forehead against the gritty stone. Panic swelled in her chest, hot and uncontrollable. She thought of her car, parked safe at the trailhead. She thought of her apartment with its unwashed dishes in the sink. She thought of her mother, who hadn't heard from her in a week. No one knows where I am. The realization struck harder than the fall. She hadn't told anyone about this trip, hadn't texted a friend, hadn't posted online. She'd just gone. Because she thought she would be back by evening, showered and tired and maybe a little proud of herself. But now it was afternoon. She didn't know how far she had slid. She didn't know if she could climb back up. She tried to move her leg. The attempt ripped a scream from her throat. Fire seared through her thigh, radiating into her hip. She froze, chest heaving, eyes wide with terror. Broken. The word rang through her skull. She'd never broken a bone before, but she didn't need a doctor to tell her. The way the pain sharpened at any twitch, the unnatural heaviness of the limb. It was wrong. Utterly wrong. The edges of her vision pulsed black. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to breathe. In, out, in, out. The gorge loomed beside her, indifferent, vast. She imagined her body tumbling the rest of the way, vanishing into the river below, and a fresh wave of panic surged. She couldn't stay pressed against this slope forever. But what could she do? She forced herself upright onto her elbows, each movement a negotiation with pain. Sweat slicked her skin, her heartbeat thudded in her temples. She glanced around, desperate for some sign of hope. The main trail was invisible above. The gorge below was death. The slope stretched steep and uneven in both directions. Her water bottle was still clipped to her pack. She reached with shaking hands, fumbling with the carabiner, and brought it to her lips. The first sip was heaven, cool and sharp. The second was nearly choked by sobs. She wanted to guzzle the whole bottle to drown her fear, but she forced herself to stop, screwing the cap back with trembling fingers. She needed to think. The truth pressed down hard. She wasn't walking out of here. Not with this leg. If she wanted to live, she would have to crawl, drag, inch her way back toward safety, back toward some chance of being seen. But that was later. For now, all she could do was survive the next few minutes without unraveling completely. She leaned back against the rock, the pain throbbing in waves, and whispered to herself in a cracked voice, "Don't die. Don't you dare die here." The gorge gave no answer. Chapter 4. Assessing Damage. Madison did not open her eyes at first. She didn't need to. Her body told her everything she wished wasn't true. The pressure inside her skull pulsed like a drum, her ribs stabbed with each breath, and something much deeper, heavier, radiated from her right leg. It was not a normal pain, not the kind of sting from a scraped knee or the throbbing ache of a twisted ankle. This was primal, wrong, like her body itself was recoiling from the injury, sounding an alarm in every nerve ending it could reach. Her fingers dug into the dirt, grounding her to reality. The earthy smell clung to her hands, a mix of crushed pine needles, moss, and damp soil. It felt almost cruel that the forest was still beautiful. Birds chattered above, a breeze rattled the branches, and somewhere water dripped rhythmically. Life continued as if nothing had happened, as though she hadn't just fallen into a nightmare. When she forced her eyes open, she found herself wedged against a slope, pine branches jutting above her like jagged teeth. She remembered the slip, her boot losing grip on loose gravel, her body tumbling sideways, gravity snatching her faster than thought. She remembered the cracking sound. She prayed it had been a branch. But her leg told her otherwise. Slowly, shakily, she sat up, biting down hard on the inside of her cheek to smother a scream. Her right thigh and shin burned as if molten iron had been poured into the bone. The limb lay twisted at a strange angle, her boot pointing out unnaturally. She couldn't even bring herself to touch it, afraid that one wrong move might send her into the abyss of agony waiting behind the fracture. Her mind spiraled into denial. Maybe it was only dislocated, maybe a sprain, maybe it would just heal if she rested for a few minutes. She clung to these fragile hopes, each one dissolving under the simple reality of how mangled her leg looked in the mottled sunlight. She counted her breaths. 1, 2, 3, trying to anchor herself. Panic hovered close, a shadow in her peripheral vision, waiting to swoop in and choke her. She could not afford it. Not yet. Instead, she checked the rest of herself. Her ribs screamed with every inhale, but nothing felt sharp inside. Her head pounded, and when she touched the side of her temple, her fingers came away sticky with blood. The cut wasn't deep, but the sight of red smeared across her skin was enough to twist her stomach. Her arms, at least, responded when she flexed them. She rotated her wrists, winced, but found nothing broken. She reached for her backpack, praying it had landed nearby. To her relief, the strap snagged on a bush a few feet uphill. She clawed toward it, dragging herself forward in short bursts, her injured leg trailing behind like dead weight. Every shift of her body sent fresh waves of fire through her bones, forcing her to grit her teeth until her jaw hurt. By the time she clutched the bag to her chest, she was shaking and drenched in sweat. Madison rifled through the contents. A half-filled water bottle, a granola bar, a small first aid kit, just the kind with bandages and antiseptic wipes, nothing remotely useful for a broken bone. She cursed under her breath, a sound swallowed immediately by the trees. She had left so much behind in the car, her extra food, her flashlight, the heavier medical kit she had once considered overpacking. She hadn't expected to need them. She had planned for a day hike, nothing more. Now the weight of that decision pressed down on her as heavily as the fallen branches above. She tried shifting her leg just slightly just to see if she could align it better. The attempt drew a scream from her throat before she could stop it, echoing raw and ragged into the quiet woods. Birds startled from the trees. She clamped a hand over her mouth, terrified her voice might carry to something wild and curious. Her eyes blurred with tears she hadn't meant to release. She blinked hard, furious at herself for crying, but the helplessness clawed at her. She was injured, alone, deep in the mountains with no cell signal and no clear path back. She could crawl, maybe. She could drag herself. But where? How far? The distances she had walked so confidently just hours ago now stretched in her imagination into endless, merciless miles. For a long while, she sat still, the backpack clutched like a lifeline, her leg pulsing in time with her heartbeat. She tried to think of what she knew, what she had read about survival in magazines or skimmed in articles she thought were more for entertainment than practical use. Stay calm, conserve energy, take inventory, don't wander blindly. Easier said than done. The afternoon sun slipped lower, the beams of light narrowing into golden shards through the canopy. Shadows lengthened. Soon it would be dark, and the idea of being trapped here, immobile, with the forest shifting and stirring around her, it rattled her bones almost as much as the injury. She closed her eyes again, this time not from pain but from necessity. She needed to breathe, to survive the next moment before she could worry about the next hour. But when she opened them again, the truth was still waiting. The leg was broken, the forest was vast, and she was very, very small. Chapter 5. First night. Madison lost time. Pain has a way of bending it, stretching minutes into hours, hours into eternities. She wasn't sure how long she sat clutching her backpack, staring at the crooked line of her leg, before she realized the light around her had shifted into that strange in-between stage when the day can no longer pretend it will last forever. The sun had begun sliding behind the mountain ridges, shadows pooling together into one long, encroaching shape. Her chest tightened. Nightfall was coming. The word carried weight she hadn't considered when she set out that morning. Back then, nightfall had meant little more than a reminder to head back toward the trailhead, maybe to stop for gas on the way home, maybe to treat herself to a drive-through milkshake. It had been a boundary in her schedule, a natural punctuation mark to an ordinary day. Now the same word felt heavier, sharper, final. Nightfall meant cold. Nightfall meant dark. Nightfall meant she would not be able to see the forest that already pressed so close, and she would be left only with sounds she couldn't identify. She wasn't ready. Her injured leg throbbed with every heartbeat, pain rolling outward in hot pulses. She tried to shift into a position that would make it hurt less, but every angle was wrong. Dirt stuck to her palms, her skin already scraped raw from dragging herself earlier. Even leaning against the slope behind her was uncomfortable, bark jutting into her back. But she couldn't waste her strength fussing about comfort. Comfort belonged to another life, the one she had lived before gravity yanked her down this slope. Her breath rattled in her chest. A cough clawed its way up her throat, shaking her ribs, making her wince. She pressed her palm to her sternum until it passed. "Calm," she whispered aloud, her voice hoarse. The word sounded tiny, like it could dissolve before it reached the trees. She fumbled through her backpack again, though she already knew what was inside. The half-full water bottle, the granola bar, the useless first aid kit. She took out the bottle, unscrewed it slowly, and sipped. The water tasted faintly metallic, warmed from the afternoon sun. She wanted to gulp it down, to feel it flood her throat, but she forced herself to take only a few mouthfuls. She had no idea when she'd find more. The granola bar she left untouched. Hunger was there, a hollow gnaw at the edges of her stomach, but she knew it was thirst that would kill her first. She tucked the food back into the bag and pulled the straps tight, holding the pack against her chest like it could anchor her to sanity. The forest changed as the sun slid lower. Birds that had chirped cheerfully all afternoon grew quiet. The breeze cooled, and with it came the smell of damp moss and decomposing leaves, richer and heavier. A mosquito whined near her ear, making her flinch. She swatted clumsily, missed, and swore under her breath. Soon, she realized, the insects would come in swarms. She had nothing to protect herself except her jacket, and even that was more suited for a brisk morning jog than a night in the mountains. She pulled it tighter around herself anyway, listening as the silence thickened. It was not true silence, though. The forest never truly slept. A twig snapped somewhere behind her. Her head whipped toward the sound, adrenaline stabbing through the haze of pain. She held her breath, waiting. Nothing emerged from the shadows. Maybe a squirrel. Maybe just a branch breaking under its own weight. But she couldn't shake the image of eyes glinting just beyond the tree line, watching. Her mind spiraled through everything she knew about the wildlife out here. Black bears, coyotes, mountain lions, though rare. The idea of being injured and defenseless in the same woods they roamed made her stomach lurch. She thought of her phone, shoved uselessly in her pocket, its screen still showing no service. She had checked at least a dozen times, each swipe upward revealing the same void where signal bars should be. The horizon burned gold one last time before the light extinguished completely. Darkness crept in, not all at once, but in gradual, relentless layers. The trees grew indistinct, their trunks melting into a wall of black. The slope behind her became a looming shadow. Above, the first stars began to blink through, cold and far away. Madison swallowed hard. She had always loved stargazing. As a kid, she used to lie on the roof of her parents' garage in Ohio, naming constellations with her father, who had taught her how to trace Orion's belt across the winter sky. Back then, the stars had been beautiful. Now they looked cruel, a reminder of how far she was from anyone who could help her. She tried to position herself for rest. It was impossible. Every adjustment made her legs scream. Lying flat was unbearable. Sitting up made her head spin. She settled into a half-reclined position, propped against her backpack, the cold earth seeping into her spine. Minutes crawled by. She counted them in her head, though she quickly lost track. The night sounds sharpened, rustles in the underbrush, wings beating above, the distant croak of a frog. Each sound made her jerk upright, eyes darting, body ready to flee though it had nowhere to go. Her breath came fast and shallow until she forced herself to inhale through her nose, exhale through her mouth. Again. Again. Her body trembled, both from cold and from the exhaustion of holding back panic. She wished she had a blanket. She wished she had a fire. She wished she had not taken that damned offshoot trail. Over and over her mind replayed the choice. That faint path that looked interesting. How she had grinned at the idea of a shortcut, of exploring something less traveled. She wanted to claw back time, to undo the moment her boot hit the gravel, to stay on the main trail where she belonged. But regret was useless now. The only direction left was forward, and forward meant through this night. She pulled her knees, her one working knee, up as far as she could and tucked her chin into her chest. She closed her eyes and willed herself to sleep. Sleep did not come. Her body hurt too much. Her thoughts churned too loudly. Memories flashed unbidden. The classroom where she taught English, the faces of her students when they asked if Shakespeare really mattered. Her tiny apartment with its chipped blue mug in the sink. Her mother's laugh when they last spoke on the phone. The ordinariness of those images made her ache worse than the leg ever could. Hours bled together. She drifted in and out of shallow dozes, each one broken by a jolt of pain or a crack in the woods. The cold deepened, gnawing at her bones. Her fingers went stiff. At one point, she woke to the sound of something moving through the brush nearby, deliberate, heavier than a squirrel. She froze, listening so hard it hurt, until the noise faded. Her heart hammered for long minutes afterward. She thought about calling out just once, on the impossible chance another hiker was close enough to hear, but fear held her tongue. If it wasn't a person, she didn't want to draw it closer. So she endured, hour by hour, eyes flicking between the faint outline of trees and the indifferent stars above. When the horizon at last began to pale, it was not relief she felt first, but disbelief. Somehow, impossibly, she had survived the night. Her body was battered, her throat dry, her mind frayed, but she was still breathing. And as the first tentative birdsong returned to the forest, Madison realized that surviving the night was only the beginning. Day 2 had arrived, and she was already running out of strength. Chapter 6. Pain Movement. The morning light was sharp, almost cruel. It slanted through the pines in cold streaks, gilding the damp rocks with a beauty that seemed designed to mock her. Madison blinked against it, eyes gritty from a night of broken half-sleep. Her body ached in ways she hadn't known were possible, stiffness like concrete in her back, raw bruises on her hips from the uneven ground, skin goose-pimpled from the cold. Her throat was dry, her lips cracked. But her leg was the real tyrant. It pulsed with its own rhythm, a deep and merciless throb that refused to be ignored. Even shifting slightly sent fire racing up her thigh. She had survived the night. That was something. But as the pale blue of morning gave way to the brighter hues of day, a grim truth settled in her chest. Nobody was coming yet. She was too far off the main trail, and she hadn't told anyone she'd be hiking this particular mountain. She had left no itinerary with friends, no precise directions. To anyone who might think of her right now, her mother in Ohio, her colleagues in the little international school back in Bologna, she was simply away for a few days. If she stayed here, she would die. The realization sat heavy, but it was also strangely clarifying. She couldn't just wait. She couldn't let her leg pin her in place until thirst or exposure did the rest. She had to move. The thought terrified her almost as much as it motivated her. She remembered the crawl she'd attempted yesterday and her first shock after the fall, the way each drag had left her gasping, the way her vision had blurred from pain. But that had been before the long night, before the slow churn of fear had transformed into something like resolve. She looked around her clearing again, searching for landmarks. The slope of scree she had tumbled down loomed behind her, an impossible wall. Ahead, through a dense line of brush and young pine, the ground seemed to angle downhill. If there was water in this valley, and she prayed there was, it would be down there. Madison took a deep breath, braced herself, and slid her pack into position. She needed her hands free. She looped one arm through the straps so the bag would drag with her, then planted her palms against the dirt. Her first shove forward was clumsy. Her good leg tucked under her, helping slightly. Her broken leg dragged behind, every shift sparking agony that made her eyes blur with tears. She screamed once, raw and involuntary, the sound tearing from her throat and echoing into the stillness. Then she kept going. Push with the arms, drag the torso, pull the pack, ignore the fire in her leg, again, again. The ground was uneven, stones digging into her elbows and ribs. Twigs snapped under her palms. Ants crawled across her wrist, biting as she brushed them off. Sweat broke across her brow even though the morning air was still cold. She fell into a brutal rhythm. Move, pant, wince, wait for the pain to dim, move again. Time became elastic, stretching and collapsing until she couldn't have guessed whether she had been crawling for 10 minutes or an hour. Her thoughts flickered between sharp and hazy. Sometimes she focused on nothing but the next handhold, the texture of the dirt beneath her fingers. Other times she thought of things she didn't want to think about. The student she had abandoned mid-term, the way her mother had laughed at her last phone call, the last text from Daniel that she still hadn't answered. She wondered if anyone would regret not knowing where she had gone. By mid-morning, the sun had risen higher. The chill burned away, replaced by a warmth that felt pleasant at first, but soon turned oppressive. Her jacket, damp with last night's sweat and dew, clung to her like a second skin. She stopped to shrug it off, wincing as she twisted her torso, then stuffed it into her bag. Without it, she felt more exposed. The sun prickled across her bare arms. She pushed onward anyway. The terrain shifted slightly as the slope eased. The undergrowth grew thicker, tangled with brambles that clawed at her skin. She used her pack to shield her path, ramming it forward into the brush, then crawling through the gap it made. Her knuckles bled from scraping stone, her trousers tore at the knee. Each drag left her more exhausted. She paused often, chest heaving, head dropping into the crook of her arm. Her broken leg throbbed mercilessly, swelling tighter and tighter within the fabric of her pants. At one point she considered tearing the fabric open to relieve the pressure, but the idea of moving it more made her stomach roll. By noon, she had made maybe 30 meters of progress. It was humiliating to think how little ground she had covered, how far the world stretched beyond her. 30 meters was nothing, but it was 30 meters she hadn't had yesterday. She found a patch of shade beneath a cluster of spruce and collapsed there, panting. Her lips were so dry she licked them constantly, though it only made the cracks sting. She allowed herself 2 swallows of water, forcing herself to stop before she drained too much. The bottle was already lighter than she wanted to admit. As she rested, her eyes drifted upward. The sky between the branches was a harsh, unbroken blue, no contrails from planes, no faint drone of human life, just silence and light. For the first time, she truly felt how enormous the world was, and how small she had become. When she tried to move again, her arms trembled so violently she barely managed to shift forward. Her strength was going, leaking out with every drag, and she had no idea how to replenish it. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The sun shifted west, and with it, her shadow stretched long across the ground. She tried not to think about nightfall, about enduring the cold again, about lying awake with every muscle stiffening. She focused only on the act of moving, of clawing forward inch by inch. In the late afternoon, her body gave out. She collapsed beside her pack, cheek pressed to the dirt, breath sawing in and out. Her arms refused to lift her. She lay there trembling, tears leaking sideways into the soil. For a long moment she thought about surrender. Just staying here, letting the forest claim her. The pain would fade eventually, wouldn't it? People died all the time without warning. Maybe hers would just be quieter, slower. But then she thought of her mother again, her mother waiting for that postcard, of her father's voice pointing out Orion's belt, of the classroom full of teenagers who had trusted her to return after break. She couldn't stop here, not yet. Madison closed her eyes, swallowed the panic swelling in her throat, and whispered to herself, "Just one more, just one more." She shoved forward. It wasn't far, it wasn't graceful, but it was movement, and it was hers. As the light began to soften into evening, Madison knew she hadn't gone far enough to be safe. But she had gone farther than she thought she could, and if she had done it once, she could do it again tomorrow. If she lived through the night. Chapter 7. Thirst Rising. By the second morning, the forest no longer seemed like a place she loved. It felt like an enemy. Madison woke with her tongue thick and dry, her lips stuck together until she pried them apart with a painful tug. Her throat burned with a scratchy rawness as if she had swallowed sand. She could still taste the metallic tang of blood from where she had bitten her cheek the day before. When she reached for her water bottle, her hand shook. She unscrewed the cap and tilted it against her lips. Only a thin trickle slid down her throat. She swirled the bottle, hearing how light it had become. Barely a quarter left, maybe less. She lowered it without drinking more. Every instinct screamed at her to gulp it down, but reason clamped down harder. Ration, ration, ration. She had no way of knowing when she might stumble onto a stream or spring, and crawling blindly meant she might also crawl away from one. Her body begged for moisture all the same. She pushed the cap back on, tucked the bottle into her bag, and braced herself for another day of movement. Her arms were weak from yesterday's crawl, muscles stiff and trembling when she tested her weight on them. Her palms were swollen, scraped raw in places where the skin had peeled from contact with stone. She flexed her fingers, watching dirt crumble from her nails. Her leg looked worse. The swelling had expanded further, straining against the torn fabric of her pants. The bruising had deepened into an ugly black purple that spread across her shin. She didn't dare move it more than she had to. "Just one more," she whispered to herself, the same mantra she had used yesterday. It was the only way to fight against the enormity of what lay ahead. She clawed forward. The forest floor was rougher today, littered with fallen branches and rocks that jabbed her ribs each time she shifted her torso. The sun rose quickly, burning away the coolness of the night. Soon she was sweating heavily, and each drop only seemed to drain her more. She licked her lips, but the salt only made her thirst sharper. By mid-morning, her vision blurred at the edges. She found herself staring at patches of moss as though they were mirages of water, The greens looked wet, glistening, and she wanted nothing more than to chew them, to suck any moisture from their fibers. She resisted at first, but finally ripped up a fistful and stuffed it into her mouth. It tasted bitter, earthy, and yielded almost nothing. The rough strands stuck to her tongue. She spat them out, tears of frustration burning her eyes. Her crawl slowed to a miserable drag. Each push of her arm sent lightning through her shoulders. Her chest heaved, lungs straining for air, though it wasn't air she needed. It was water. Always water. She thought of her kitchen back in Bologna, the clink of glasses under the tap, the cool stream pouring endlessly clear. She thought of ice cubes rattling in a summer drink. She thought of orange juice, condensation beating on the glass. The memories hurt. At one point she caught herself muttering aloud, fragments of sentences. Water fountain at school, kids always crowding, shouldn't drink after them, germs. She broke off, startled at the sound of her own voice. It cracked, hoarse and alien, bouncing weakly off the trees. She shook her head, trying to clear it. Focus. Movement. One more. The ground began sloping downward again, giving her hope she might be crawling toward a water source. Her ears strained for the sound of trickling, but all she heard was the constant rasp of her own breathing and the faint stir of wind through leaves. By noon, the sun pressed down like a punishment. Her skin stung where it was exposed, especially across her arms and neck. She pulled her jacket loosely over her shoulders to shield herself, but the heat beneath the fabric quickly grew suffocating. She alternated, jacket on, jacket off, unable to decide which misery she could better endure. Her throat was a battlefield. Swallowing had become painful, a dry scrape with nothing to soothe it. She let herself take a small sip from the bottle, but it barely made a dent. Her body screamed for more, and it took everything she had not to drain the rest. When she tried crawling again, her arms buckled, and she collapsed face first into the dirt. She lay there, cheek pressed against pine needles, for a long time. Her thoughts circled in panicked loops. I can't, I'll die here. But then another voice, stubborn and low, broke through. Move. She groaned, rolled her weight onto her elbows, and shoved herself forward. The hours blurred together after that. Her world shrank to the space directly in front of her, the patch of soil she needed to reach, the next root to clutch, the next inch to claim. Sometimes she closed her eyes while moving, dragging herself forward blind, too weary to care where she landed. In the late afternoon she caught a sound that made her heart lurch, a faint gurgle like water slipping over stone. She froze, straining to listen. It came again, distant but real. Adrenaline jolted her, sharper than anything she'd felt all day. She forced her arms to work, shoving her pack ahead, dragging herself toward the noise. Every muscle screamed, but she ignored it. Minutes stretched unbearably. The sound faded, then returned. She followed it desperately, praying it wasn't a hallucination born of thirst. Finally, she pushed through a cluster of ferns and saw it. A narrow trickle of water running over rocks, pooling shallowly in a crease of earth. She almost sobbed. Crawling the last few feet, she lowered her head and drank directly, uncaring of dirt or insects floating on the surface. The cold water was heaven, sliding down her throat, shocking her body back into life. She drank until her stomach cramped, then forced herself to stop, knowing too much at once could make her sick. She filled her bottle, capped it, and lay back in the grass, panting. Relief washed through her in dizzy waves. For the first time in 2 days, her thirst was not the sharp edge of her world. But even as she closed her eyes, she knew the reprieve would be short. Night was coming again, and she was still deep in the wilderness with a broken leg, her body fraying, her mind stretched thin. The water had saved her today. Tomorrow, something else might try to kill her. Chapter 8. The Heat of the Day. The morning sun rose without mercy, cresting the high ridges of the Picos de Europa and spilling light across the limestone cliffs like molten gold. For Madison, however, there was nothing beautiful in its radiance. By mid-morning the air was already thick, the stillness of the valley pressing down on her like a hand, and the sun was relentless. It pierced through every crack of shade she had crawled toward, baking the stones until they radiated heat against her arms and face. The trail, narrow and uneven, had become a corridor of fire. Her broken leg throbbed in dull waves, the swelling pressing tight against her skin. She'd tied it as best she could with a strip from her t-shirt, but it was no splint, only crude compression. Every drag forward sent splinters of pain through her thigh, radiating down into her calf and up into her spine. She clenched her jaw until her teeth ached, biting back the screams that threatened to tear from her throat. The worst, though, was the thirst. Her lips cracked as though they had been cut with glass. Her tongue felt swollen, heavy, clinging uselessly to the roof of her mouth. She had long since drained the little water she had brought with her. The bottle had seemed enough for a day hike when she had packed it that morning in the hostel, her mind so full of adventure and eagerness that she hadn't considered disaster. Now it mocked her, the empty plastic rattling faintly against her pack each time she moved, a hollow sound that grated against her nerves. Madison pulled herself another meter forward, skin scraping against rock. The sun baked her exposed arms until they tingled with the burn of impending blisters. Sweat pooled in the hollows of her back, soaking into her waistband, and then dried almost immediately, leaving behind a salty crust on her skin. She licked her lips, desperate for any trace of moisture, but there was nothing. The cliffs around her were quiet except for the distant cry of birds. Vultures, perhaps. The thought chilled her more than she wanted to admit. She had seen them circling earlier in the morning, far above, dark specks gliding in lazy circles on the thermal currents. Were they watching her? Did they sense weakness already? She wanted to laugh at herself for being paranoid, but the sound would have cost too much precious moisture from her throat. By noon, her vision began to blur. White light flooded her eyes, bleaching the world until it seemed unreal, a flat, burning dreamscape of stone and sky. Her thoughts drifted. She remembered sitting with her brother on the porch of their childhood home in Oregon, the two of them sharing a bottle of iced tea after soccer practice, laughing at nothing at all. The condensation from the glass had dripped onto her hands, cool and miraculous. She could almost feel it now, slick against her palms. Her heart clenched with longing so sharp it was almost physical. Madison shook her head violently, as if she could dislodge the memory. No. She couldn't slip away into fantasies. That was the beginning of surrender. She needed to focus on the ground in front of her, on the movement of her elbows and knees, on the next patch of shadow no matter how small. Focus. Focus. But the sun would not let her focus. It hammered down with cruel persistence. Her skin reddened, shoulders and nose raw from exposure. She found herself gasping, panting as if she had been running for miles, though she had only moved a few meters in an hour. Each breath felt as if it dried her lungs further, turning the soft tissue inside her chest into brittle paper. At some point, she became aware of her own smell. Sour sweat, dried blood, and the faint stench of infection from the torn flesh around her leg. The odor sickened her, but there was no escape from it. She was trapped in her own deteriorating body. The afternoon dragged on in a haze of heat. The trail, if it could be called that, seemed endless, stretching forward in a blur of stone and thorn. Once, she spotted a cluster of alpine flowers pushing bravely through the cracks of rock, their petals a startling purple. She stared at them for a long time, mesmerized by their defiance, their ability to thrive in this inhospitable place where she felt she was withering. She wanted to weep, but her eyes were too dry to produce tears. Her mind wandered again, this time to her job back in Portland. She thought of her desk with its half-dead plant, of her co-workers whose voices had often blended into white noise during endless meetings. She had come here to Spain to escape that monotony, to feel alive. Now, crawling on her belly through the dust, she wondered if she had been alive then, in ways she hadn't appreciated. She wondered if she would ever see that desk again, or the city lights, or her mother's kitchen with its perpetually whistling kettle. By late afternoon, the sun angled slightly lower, but it offered no true relief. Her skin burned as though she had been flayed. Every surface felt hostile: stone that scorched, thorns that clawed, dust that clung to her throat. She dragged herself into the meager shade of a boulder, collapsing against it with a groan. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged breaths. "I can't," she whispered aloud. The words barely sounded, all more vibration than voice. Her lips cracked anew at the effort. She closed her eyes, listening to the blood pulse behind her ears. But even as despair coiled around her, something flickered within. A stubborn spark. If she gave up now, then what had been the point of clawing forward these past 2 days? What would her family say, knowing she had stopped trying when she still had strength enough to move? She imagined her father's voice, steady, practical, urging her not to let the mountain win. She rolled back onto her elbows, forcing herself to crawl again. Every inch was agony, her body screaming in rebellion, but she pushed through the haze of dizziness. The heat did not relent until the sun began to dip, the shadows stretching long across the valley floor. Relief came in the form of cooler air, but by then Madison was barely conscious, her thoughts jumbled, her movements automatic. She dragged herself into another patch of shadow and lay there trembling, her chest rattling with shallow breaths. The day had scoured her raw. She had no tears, no saliva, no strength left. Only the faint, stubborn beat of her heart reminded her she was still alive. As darkness approached, Madison curled onto her side, her broken leg a swollen mass of fire. Her skin radiated heat, her lips split and bleeding. The vultures were still circling far above. She closed her eyes, hoping that when morning came, she would still have the will to move. Chapter 9. Rainfall. The night had been merciful only in that the air was cooler than the furnace of day. But mercy was a relative term. Madison barely slept, if what she drifted in and out of could be called sleep at all. Every time her eyes closed, the pain in her leg or the ache in her back yanked her awake. Her body pulsed with heat, feverish from sunburn and thirst, and her mind swam in half-dreams that made little sense. Her brother calling to her from a soccer field that stretched endlessly into stone, her mother's kettle screaming into the silence of the cliffs, the hostel owner in Podez shaking his head, saying she had gone the wrong way. When the sky finally began to pale in the east, she felt no relief. Morning only meant she would have to start moving again, dragging her battered body over the unforgiving ground, with nothing but grit and determination to keep her alive. She licked at her lips, which were swollen and split, tasting iron. Her throat felt like it had been lined with sand. The air, though, was different. Heavy. Damp. Madison noticed it first when the faintest breeze rolled down the gorge. It smelled faintly of ozone, of wet stone, of something sharp and electric. She blinked at the sky above. Low clouds had gathered while she wasn't paying attention, their bellies swollen and gray, moving faster than she would have thought possible. A storm. Her heart twisted with hope and fear in equal measure. Rain could mean water, salvation. She could drink, finally, even if it was from the cupped palms of her hands or from her shirt wrung out into her mouth. But storms in the mountains were never gentle. The cliffs she crawled along could funnel water into sudden torrents, slopes could become slick death traps. A storm might finish what the fall had started. Still, when the first fat drop struck her forearm, it was like being touched by a miracle. Madison dragged herself upright as best she could, leaning against the boulder that had sheltered her through the night. She tilted her head back and opened her mouth. The second drop landed on her cheek, then another, cool against her blistered skin. She moaned aloud, a raw, broken sound that startled even her. And then, as if the heavens had waited for her acknowledgement, the sky split open. The rain fell in sheets, cold, heavy, relentless. Within moments, Madison was soaked through, her clothes clinging to her burned skin. She opened her mouth wide, catching what she could, gulping greedily. It wasn't much, most of it slid off her face, spilling past her chin, but it was enough to ease the worst of her torment. She stuck out her tongue, desperate like a child. When the flow overwhelmed her, she pressed her shirt to her mouth, sucking moisture from the fabric. She didn't care that it tasted faintly of sweat and dust. She nearly sobbed with relief, the cool liquid trickling down her throat. Her body shuddered as if every cell woke at once, screaming for more. But the joy of water was tempered almost instantly by the danger it brought. The rocks beneath her became slick, each movement now a gamble. The trail's already precarious footing dissolved into mud in places, and rivulets began carving paths down the slope, carrying grit and pebbles with them. The cliffs on either side echoed with the sudden rush of water, the sound magnified and multiplied until it was impossible to tell how close the runoff was. A crack of thunder rolled through the valley, deep enough to vibrate her ribs. Madison flinched. The storm was directly overhead. Lightning flashed, blinding white against the gray, illuminating jagged ridges like bones. For an instant, the whole world seemed carved from stark contrast: black cliffs, silver water, a lone woman clinging to survival. She tried to move, but her injured leg slipped immediately, sending fire through her thigh. She collapsed onto her elbows, cheek pressed against the wet stone. The cold rain that had been salvation moments earlier now chilled her to the marrow. Shivers racked her body, uncontrollable and violent. Hypothermia whispered in the back of her mind. The warmth she had cursed all day was now gone, replaced by an enemy just as cruel. Madison forced herself to crawl again inch by inch, fighting both the terrain and the storm. Water ran over her hands as she dragged them forward, her palms raw and bleeding from days of abuse. Mud clung to her knees, caked beneath her nails. She wanted to stop, to huddle against the rock and wait, but every instinct told her stillness was death. She had to keep moving, even if it was only a few feet at a time. The rain poured on without pause, drenching everything. Her backpack grew heavy, dragging at her shoulders, her hair plastered against her face, strands tangling across her eyes until she had to shake her head violently to clear them. Every breath came ragged, steam rising from her lips in the chill air. Hours blurred. Thunder rolled and rolled. The world shrank to the patch of earth in front of her and the pain inside her body. At some point, she slipped fully into a stream of runoff and nearly lost her grip on the rocks, the water tugging her downhill toward a drop she couldn't see. She screamed, not in words, but in raw panic, and clawed her way back to the edge, nails tearing. She collapsed there, chest heaving, water streaming over her face. Her mind cracked at the edges. She thought she saw movement in the rain, a figure standing on the ridge above, blurred by mist. She blinked hard, rainwater stinging her eyes, but when she looked again there was nothing. Only the rain. She laughed bitterly, a sound that dissolved into a cough. Hallucinations, she realized. The storm, the dehydration, the pain. They were stripping away her grip on reality one piece at a time. Still, she kept crawling. By late afternoon, the storm began to ease. The rain thinned to a drizzle, the thunder receding into the distance. The cliffs glistened in its aftermath, every surface slick and shining, rivulets still dripping in countless places. Madison collapsed in the shadow of another boulder, body trembling uncontrollably. Her lips were swollen, her fingers numb, her broken leg pulsing with infection. But her belly, for the first time since the accident, held water. Not enough to truly quench her thirst, but enough to quiet the screaming of her body for a little while. Enough to let her cling to one fragile thought: she had survived the storm. And survival, for now, was enough. Chapter 10. Hallucinations. The rain had stopped sometime in the night, but its echo lingered. Every surface around her dripped steadily, the sound 1,000 tiny clocks ticking out of sync. The air was damp and chill, and mist curled low between the boulders like pale smoke. Madison lay slumped against her pack, her body convulsing now and again with shivers that racked her thin frame. Sleep had come only in desperate fragments, a handful of minutes stolen here and there before pain or cold forced her awake. When she opened her eyes to the pale light of dawn, her body felt alien, as though she had been left inside a husk someone else had once inhabited. Her limbs trembled when she tried to move, her muscles refusing to answer commands without hesitation. Her broken leg was swollen grotesquely, the skin stretched an angry red, radiating heat. A foul smell lingered whenever she shifted, her body telling her plainly that infection was taking root. She tried to focus on the practical. Water. She had moisture trapped in her clothes still, clinging to the fibers of her shirt and jacket, though less now. She squeezed the fabric into her mouth, sucking greedily, ignoring the bitter tang. It helped only a little. Her throat remained parched. Food. Her backpack held only crumbs now. She had stretched out what snacks she had carried far beyond what they had been meant for, but the last of it was gone last night. Her stomach had begun to devour itself, knotting and cramping in waves that doubled her over. And yet, despite the cruel clarity of her body's needs, her mind no longer obeyed simple logic. Thoughts slipped and tangled, reality bled into memory bled into dream. She started crawling inch by inch, because motion was the only thing that kept despair at bay. Each scrape of her elbows across stone was accompanied by an orchestra of agony in her leg, but she had long since stopped crying out. The pain was simply part of her world now, like the rocks or the air. The mist made distance impossible to judge. She could have moved meters or miles, she couldn't tell anymore. It was then that she heard her name. Madison. Clear, unmistakable. A woman's voice, soft but urgent. Her head snapped up, heart pounding. The cliffs around her were empty, the trail nothing but jagged stone dissolving into fog. She blinked rapidly, scanning, desperate. Here, the voice said again, closer now. Come on. She dragged herself forward, her pulse a wild drum. She knew it was impossible, there was no one out here, no reason for anyone to be, but hope dug its claws in. What if by some miracle another hiker had taken this trail? What if someone had been looking? She strained her eyes, and there, yes, there, a figure just ahead blurred in the mist. A woman, standing, hand outstretched. Madison sobbed, a sound that broke out of her throat without permission. She clawed herself forward, her palms slipping on damp rock. But as she drew closer, the figure wavered, dissolved, reformed. Her stomach turned to ice. It was her mother. Not her mother as she looked now, but as Madison remembered her from childhood. Hair in a bun, apron tied at the waist, flour dusting her hands. She stood barefoot on the stone as if the mountain were a kitchen floor. Madison, sweetheart, the apparition said, smiling gently. Come inside, it's warm. Madison froze, her heart splitting between ecstasy and horror. Tears, or the ghost of them since her eyes were too dry to truly weep, blurred her vision. Mom. The word scraped from her throat, cracked and raw. Please, please help me. Her mother only tilted her head, still smiling, and then faded into the mist as if she had never been. Madison collapsed forward, forehead pressing into the cold rock. A sob tore from her, full and shaking, the kind of sound she had always swallowed back in life. The mountain swallowed the noise, gave nothing back. She was alone again. Time lost meaning after that. She crawled, rested, crawled again. The mist shifted with the light, sometimes parting enough to reveal jagged ridges, sometimes closing in so tightly it felt like a shroud. She spoke to herself aloud, words tumbling out because silence pressed too hard. She told herself stories, half-remembered ones from her childhood. She recited recipes she knew by heart. She sang snippets of songs under her breath until her voice broke. And then the voices returned. Her brother this time, calling from somewhere above, "Come on, Maddie, you're too slow." His voice was laughing, playful, so real she almost expected to see him bounding across the rocks, soccer ball tucked under one arm. She clawed toward the sound, only to find nothing but empty stone. Once, she was sure she saw hikers with backpacks ahead of her. 2 of them, bright jackets moving with purpose. She tried to shout, but what emerged from her throat was only a rasp. She crawled until her vision cleared, until the figures melted into nothing, leaving her sprawled in despair. As the day dragged on, the hallucinations worsened. The rocks themselves seemed to change, taking on strange shapes. One boulder looked like a crouching man, another like a dog waiting patiently for her to catch up. She cursed at them, then begged them for help. At one point she laughed hysterically, a sound that frightened her with how unhinged it was. Hunger gnawed so fiercely she began imagining food with obsessive detail, a slice of bread, steam still rising from it, a bowl of noodles slick with oil, cold orange juice, tart and sweet. She could almost smell them. Her stomach cramped, saliva trickling finely into her mouth, though it hurt to swallow. The cruelty of it made her want to scream. By evening, as the light began to fade again, the mist finally lifted slightly, revealing the ridgeline in stark relief. Madison dragged herself toward the shelter of an overhang, collapsing onto her side, chest heaving. The hallucinations had ebbed slightly, but they had left her shaken, afraid of her own mind. If she couldn't trust her senses, how would she know when real help came? Would she mistake her rescuers for another dream and crawl away from them? Her body was beyond exhaustion. Every muscle quivered with fatigue, her legs swollen to twice its normal size. Infection spread like wildfire. She could feel it in the way her thoughts lagged, in the fever heat radiating from her skin. As night swallowed the cliffs again, Madison lay trembling beneath the rock overhang, mind splintering under hunger, thirst, and pain. Her last coherent thought before darkness claimed her was a simple, fragile prayer. Please, let tomorrow be real. Chapter 11. Food runs out. The morning brought no relief, only the knowledge that she had made it through another night. Madison awoke to the harsh rattle of her own coughing, her chest tight, her lips stuck together until she pried them apart with a painful lick. Every joint screamed as she shifted, her broken leg now an unholy weight dragging at the rest of her body. It took her a full 5 minutes to remember where she was, who she was, why she was lying in the shadow of jagged cliffs on a wet bed of rock. Her mind felt swollen, as if it had been stuffed with wool. When memory returned, it hit like a hammer. The fall, the crawling, the hallucinations of her mother and brother. She lay there trembling, unsure if she even wanted to remember. And then, her stomach seized. The cramps doubled her over before she could fight them, a deep, clawing ache that radiated from her core and left her whimpering like a wounded animal. Hunger had taken on a new form, no longer the dull ache of emptiness, but something sharper, angrier, violent. Her body demanded food it knew she didn't have, squeezing her insides until she gagged on nothing but bile. She pawed weakly at her pack, half hoping some overlooked scrap had hidden itself away. Her fingers trembled as she pulled it open, rummaging through the crumpled wrappers, the empty water flask, the useless guidebook now warped from rain. Nothing. Just the smell of stale crumbs clinging to plastic. She pressed one of the wrappers to her lips anyway, sucking it for a hint of salt, of sugar, of anything. She scraped at the corners of her backpack, shaking out specks of granola and licking them from her palm like they were treasure. It wasn't enough. It wasn't even close. A low sob escaped her before she could stop it. Please, the word cracked out of her, a plea not directed at anyone in particular. She thought about berries, mushrooms, anything natural growing along the trail. But the cliffs here were barren, nothing but stone and scrubby moss. Even if something edible existed nearby, she didn't have the strength, or the knowledge, to trust it. A mistake could kill her faster than starvation. Still, her body screamed for fuel. The cramps didn't stop. They came in waves. Her hands shook as she crawled forward, dragging herself along the trail. The sound of her stomach, loud and hollow, seemed to echo against the rock walls. Her mind drifted to food obsessively. She imagined thick slices of bread warm from the oven, steam still curling from the crust. She pictured bowls of lentils she used to cook in her small kitchen, simmering with garlic and onion until the apartment filled with their earthy smell. She thought of fruit, apples, pears, strawberries bursting with juice. Each image stabbed her with longing so intense she nearly cried. Once, in a cruel moment of delirium, she thought she smelled it, roasted chicken, rich and savory. She lifted her head, inhaling desperately, but the air held nothing except damp stone and her own rank sweat. She laughed, short and broken. Her brain was mocking her now. The day wore on. She crawled, rested, crawled again. Her pace slowed to almost nothing, every movement costing more than she had to give. She sucked moisture from her shirt when she could, but her thirst was back, gnawing at her throat as much as hunger clawed at her gut. By afternoon she was hallucinating again, but differently than before. The visions weren't people this time. They were food. She swore she saw apples scattered on the rocks ahead, glowing faintly in the sun, but when she reached for them, her hand met only dust. She thought she saw a sandwich tucked between stones. She lunged, nearly fainting from the effort, and her fingers closed on nothing but moss. Her laughter at this point sounded less like amusement and more like the ragged edge of madness. She clutched her stomach, whispering to herself, "Not real, not real, not real." But her body didn't care about logic. Her body wanted sustenance now. As night fell, the weakness grew terrifying. Her arms trembled under her own weight. Her vision blurred so that the rocks shifted and swam like water. She could no longer tell if the low roaring in her ears was wind through the gorge or her own failing body. The thought hit her then, cold and sharp. Starvation might kill me before infection does. She curled herself under another rocky outcrop, shaking uncontrollably. Every bone in her body jutted against skin that felt too thin, too fragile. She clutched her belly, whispering to herself, whispering names. Her brother, her mother, her own, just to remind herself she was still there. And in the suffocating dark, as her stomach growled like an animal in pain, Madison realized something with horrifying clarity. The hunger wasn't going to go away. It would only get worse. Unless someone found her, or she found them. Soon, this would be the way she died. Chapter 12. Predators. Fear. The night stretched on like an endless tunnel, swallowing Madison whole. After the first few days of injury and exposure, she had begun to measure time less by the sun, and more by the shift of the forest's breathing, the cool hush of morning, the rising chorus of cicadas, the lethargic heat of afternoon, the restless stirring of evening. But the nights? That was when the mountains revealed another face entirely. On this night, the air was brittle and sharp, laced with dampness that rose from the ground. Madison had managed to wedge herself beneath a sloping shelf of rock, not quite a cave, but enough to give her some illusion of protection. Her broken leg throbbed mercilessly, the swelling tight against her skin, and every time she shifted her weight, she felt the stab of bone grating faintly against itself. Yet the pain was no longer the worst of it. It was the sounds. At first, it had been owls, the long and tremulous notes echoing in the trees, a song she would have once found beautiful on a camping trip. Then came the rustling, the unmistakable shuffle of paws through underbrush. Madison froze, pressing her back against the stone, listening so intently she could feel her own pulse hammering in her ears. She had grown up in Oregon, in the suburbs of Bend, where hikes were frequent and encounters with wildlife were limited to glimpses of deer at dawn or the occasional porcupine. She knew, academically, that these mountains were home to far more than deer. Cougars prowled here, bears too, lumbering silently across trails, their strength unimaginable up close. Coyotes hunted in packs, and she, lying here helpless with a broken leg, could not defend herself from any of them. The rustle grew louder, closer. Madison's chest clenched so tightly she thought she might suffocate. She fumbled at the ground beside her, fingers curling around a loose rock. Her hand shook as she lifted it. The stone wasn't even the size of a softball. It would barely bruise, but it was all she had. Then came the sound she had dreaded, a low, throaty growl carrying through the night air. It wasn't close enough to vibrate in her chest, but it was near, so near. Her entire body went rigid. She held her breath, terrified that the sound of her lungs pulling air would betray her position. The seconds dragged. Somewhere above her a branch snapped. The growl cut off, replaced by the sound of deliberate movement, heavy steps pressing into fallen pine needles. She tried to imagine what it might be. A cougar moved silently, didn't it? At least that's what she remembered from those nature documentaries her dad used to play on Saturday mornings. Cougars stalked their prey with grace, almost noiseless. So maybe it wasn't that. A bear, then? Her stomach twisted at the thought. The smell hit her a second later. Musky, pungent, sour. Her throat constricted. She knew instinctively. Bear. Madison bit down on her knuckles, stifling a whimper. The animal was so close she could hear the faint huff of its breath. She imagined its hulking form, the broad shoulders, the glint of its eyes scanning the dark. She thought of how easily it could crush her in a single blow. Minutes stretched like hours. The bear shuffled, snuffling at the ground, tearing at something in the soil. Madison stayed frozen, her every muscle locked in place. Even her leg, her cursed, broken leg, she tried to keep still, though the trembling of her body threatened to shake the whole rock ledge. At last, after what must have been 10 minutes but felt eternal, the steps grew distant. The bear moved away, leaving behind only silence, broken by Madison's shallow, ragged breaths. She released the rock in her hand, and it clattered softly onto the dirt. Only then did she let herself cry. Not sobbing. Her chest was too tight for that. But a slow leaking of tears down her cheeks, hot against her cold skin. It wasn't just fear. It was the crushing realization of how defenseless she truly was. If the bear had wanted her, she would have been powerless. She could not run. She could not fight. She had never felt smaller. The night deepened, and Madison did not sleep. Each time she closed her eyes, she imagined glowing eyes watching her, claws scraping stone, jaws closing around her neck. Sleep would not come, not in this state. She counted breaths instead, clinging to the rhythm as though it tethered her to sanity. Hours later, as dawn's pale light seeped over the mountains, Madison stirred stiffly. The forest looked different in the morning, gentler, washed in muted silver, but the fear of the night clung to her skin like a second layer. Every rustle of branches, every crow's call made her flinch. The day offered no mercy either. She had to move again, crawling inch by inch across sharp ground, dragging her ruined leg behind her. The exhaustion of the night still clung to her, and with every scrape of her arms, she imagined predators watching from the tree line. When the sun fell again that evening, she dreaded the return of the dark more than the pain of her body. And as the crickets began their chorus, she whispered aloud, her voice cracked and raw, "Please, just leave me alone tonight." But the mountains were not kind, and fear remained her closest companion. Chapter 13. The Gorge. Madison had been crawling for what felt like days, though she knew it couldn't have been more than a handful of hours since sunrise. Time had become warped, shredded into fragments of exertion and pain. Each drag forward left her palms raw, her elbows burning with scrapes, her shoulders screaming from pulling the dead weight of her useless leg. She had learned to measure progress not by distance, but by markers in the landscape. A tree stump, a mossy boulder, a patch of wildflowers that looked surreal in their brightness against the drab earth. By late afternoon, the light slanted through the trees at an angle that painted everything in gold. It was beautiful in a cruel way, the forest reminding her of what it was when she wasn't suffering inside it. But the beauty gave way, suddenly and brutally, to something else. The trees thinned. The ground began to slope downward, the pine needles slick beneath her palms. Madison blinked through sweat and dirt, and then, with a sinking heart, she realized what lay ahead. A gorge. It wasn't a canyon of cinematic grandeur, not the vast, yawning chasms she had seen in postcards or documentaries, but to her, crawling on a broken leg, it might as well have been the Grand Canyon. The earth split open before her, a jagged wound carved into the mountain. The opposite side wasn't impossibly far, maybe 30 yards, but the drop between was sheer, the walls steep and crumbling. A thin trickle of water glistened at the bottom, more mud than stream, reflecting the late light like a blade. Madison stopped at the edge, chest heaving, her fingernails packed with dirt from clawing forward. A thin laugh bubbled up from her throat, brittle and hopeless. "Of course," she rasped aloud, her voice hoarse from thirst. "Of course this is here." Her father's voice echoed in her memory, some hiking advice he had repeated when she was a teenager. "You can plan for the trail. You can't plan for the mountain." At the time she had rolled her eyes, impatient, eager to prove she knew what she was doing. Now the words pressed down like a curse. She leaned forward on her elbows, peering into the ravine. The bottom was far enough to mean death if she fell, but not crossing wasn't an option either. To turn back meant starvation, dehydration, and exposure. The gorge was an obstacle she would have to solve, broken leg or not. Her mind began working in stuttering bursts, half from instinct, half from desperation. She scanned left and right, eyes darting along the rim. The slope to her right looked marginally less sheer, a scatter of rocks forming what could almost be a descent path. To her left, fallen logs spanned portions of the gap, though none were close enough to make a full bridge. Madison licked her cracked lips, tasting blood from where she had bitten them in her sleep. Every option looked lethal, but she forced herself to think, to weigh, to choose. The right side, the descent. It wasn't a choice so much as a resignation, an animal instinct pulling her toward what seemed least impossible. She dragged herself along the rim until she reached the rocky section. Her arms shook with every motion, but she pressed forward, whispering aloud, as though giving voice to her determination could make it stronger. "One more foot, just one more." When she reached the edge of the slope, she paused. Below, jagged rocks jutted out like teeth. A slip here would not be survivable. She braced herself, adjusted her weight, and began to lower her body onto the incline. The world contracted into a blur of grit and muscle strain. Her palms burned as she tried to grip at stones and tufts of grass, but everything gave way too easily. Her broken leg dragged uselessly, catching on outcrops, sending flares of agony up her spine. She bit down on her sleeve to keep from screaming. Halfway down she slipped. It wasn't dramatic, no cinematic plunge, no sudden lurch into freefall, but the earth simply slid beneath her, a rush of pebbles and soil tearing loose. She clawed at the slope, nails breaking, skin ripping. Her body slammed against rock, her hip bruising, her leg twisting in a way that stole her breath. For a few heart-stopping seconds, she was sliding straight toward the drop. Adrenaline surged. With a desperate animal cry, she jammed her arm against a root protruding from the wall. It held, barely. Her body wrenched to a stop, dangling halfway down, the void yawning below. Her chest heaved as panic seized her lungs. "Not like this," she whispered, teeth gritted. "Not like this." With trembling arms, she hauled herself closer to the slope, pressing her chest against the dirt. Inch by inch, she moved sideways, dragging her ruined leg like dead weight. The root groaned under her grip, threatening to tear free, but she didn't let go until her other hand found another hold. The crawl resumed, agonizingly slow, agonizingly careful. Dirt crumbled beneath her fingers, stones rolled out from under her elbows, but she inched down, down, until at last she reached the bottom. She collapsed in the mud at the gorge's base, sobbing with exhaustion, tears streaking mud across her face. Every muscle screamed, her body a patchwork of bruises and open cuts. But she was alive. She had made it down. She lay there for what could have been minutes or hours, her breath ragged, her chest shuddering with each inhale. The trickle of water nearby glistened, mocking her with its inaccessibility, dark, filthy, pooling in uneven patches of mud. Still, she dragged herself toward it. The water was rank, tasting of earth and rot, but she didn't care. She cupped her filthy hands, brought them to her lips, and drank. The liquid coated her tongue with grit, but relief flooded through her parched throat. When she finally pulled back, gasping, she realized the other side of the gorge loomed even higher than the one she had descended. She had only crossed half the battle. The climb up remained. Madison pressed her forehead into the mud, groaning. It would take everything she had left, maybe more. But she wasn't dead yet, and so, dragging her battered body forward once more, she began to crawl toward the far wall. Chapter 14. Despair. The gorge had taken more out of her than she could ever admit. She had thought when she reached the bottom that she was halfway through the worst of it. But standing at the base of that ravine and seeing the far side tower above her had crushed something inside that even the pain of her leg couldn't touch. She had clawed her way down into darkness, and now the mountain demanded more. It wanted her blood, her will, her very soul. She had tried to climb. God, she had tried. For hours she pulled herself upward, finding grips in roots, jagged stones, patches of damp earth. Her palms were split and bleeding, her elbows raw, her good knee mottled purple from slamming into rock. Each time she thought she was gaining ground, the earth would crumble and she would slide back, another few feet erased, her energy bled out with the dirt cascading beneath her. By midday, she gave up. She lay at the gorge floor, her chest heaving, the broken leg stretched grotesquely at her side. It was swelling now, the skin stretched tight and angry, every touch a jolt of white-hot pain. She hadn't eaten in a day and a half. She had only sips of foul water coating her lips, and even that was rationed by the mud's trickle. Flies buzzed around her, landing on her wounds, tiny irritants that felt like insults. And something in her broke. She stared at the wall of earth above, the jagged rim outlined in pale sunlight, and she whispered hoarsely, "I can't." It came out as barely a sound, more exhale than word, but it was real, and once it was spoken, it echoed. She repeated it, again and again, tears leaking down her dirt-crusted cheeks. "I can't, I can't, I can't." The words filled the gorge, filled her chest. Her throat tightened and sobs burst out, ragged and raw. For the first time since the fall, she stopped trying to hide her fear from herself. She let it consume her, curling her body around it, trembling with the truth. She wasn't strong enough. She had believed in determination, in grit, in the stubborn flame of survival. But here, in this hollow of stone surrounded by walls that didn't care if she lived or died, Madison realized that sometimes the mountain won. She lay there for hours, drifting in and out of half-sleep. Dreams bled into reality, visions of her mother's hands folding laundry, of Daniel leaning in the doorway telling her to stay home, of herself sitting in her flat sipping tea and watching the rain smear the glass. In those visions she was whole, safe, ordinary. Then she'd blink, and the gorge pressed back in, the smell of damp earth and blood and sweat suffocating her. By evening, the shadows grew long, and with them came the chill. The air at the gorge floor turned cold faster than she expected, the stone walls trapping dampness. She shivered violently, her thin jacket no match for the alpine night. Every muscle cramped, her injured leg throbbing with each spasm. In the darkness, noises rose. Small rocks shifted on the slopes, the sound of tiny paws scurrying. Once, a larger sound echoed, a snapping branch, the crunch of weight. Madison's heart clenched, her body frozen. She knew wolves existed in the Dolomites, though rare. More likely a deer, she told herself, or a fox. Still, the noise filled her with primal fear. She curled tighter, clutching her useless leg as though holding it would anchor her to life. The despair whispered louder. What if this is where they find you? If they ever do? A body at the bottom of a gorge, a tourist who thought she could take a shortcut. Another nameless cautionary tale. Her mind spiraled. She imagined search parties combing the marked trails, calling her name, while her body lay unseen in this hidden crease of the mountain. She imagined headlines. London woman missing in Italy. Suspected fall. No body recovered. Her parents would never know the truth, not fully. She would vanish into rumor, a ghost of a hiker lost in the Dolomites. The thought crushed her. Her sobs gave way to silence, an empty quiet where her breathing was the only proof she still existed. She felt hollow, as though the mountain had scraped her clean inside. At some point in the black of night, she pressed her face into the cold earth and whispered, "I'm sorry." She didn't even know to whom. To her parents, for worrying them. To Daniel, for leaving him. To herself, for failing. The apology spilled into the dirt like a confession, swallowed instantly by the silence. She closed her eyes then, and for the first time she did not picture making it out. She pictured rest. She pictured release. The gorge cradled her in darkness, and Madison drifted toward the dangerous edge of surrender. Chapter 15. The Second Wind. Dawn came without warmth. The first light inched down into the gorge like a reluctant visitor, brushing the stone walls with a pale, lifeless gray. Madison stirred when it touched her, her body stiff from cold, her mouth caked with dirt. She had slept in fragments, minutes stolen between shivers, her body locked in knots of pain. Every joint ached, her muscles screamed in protest, and her broken leg had swollen grotesquely in the night. When she first opened her eyes, there was nothing, not even fear, just a blankness. She felt more corpse than woman, her chest rising and falling on reflex rather than will. She almost stayed that way. She almost closed her eyes again and let the gorge hold her until her body gave out for good. There was a pull in that thought, a siren call that promised no more crawling, no more tearing her hands open on rock, no more thirst clawing at her throat. Only silence. But something small, almost imperceptible, tugged at her. It wasn't loud, it wasn't cinematic, it was a thin thread of memory. Her mother's voice on the phone weeks ago, bright and proud, telling Madison how much she admired her daughter's courage to travel alone, how she couldn't wait to hear the stories when she got back. That voice was enough to keep her eyes open. Madison blinked, focused on the rim above. The light was stronger now, golden hues replacing gray. The mountain hadn't changed. The gorge was still impossibly steep, her body still wrecked. But something in her shifted. She whispered aloud, voice cracked, "Not here." Her throat burned from the words, but she repeated them, louder this time. "Not here." The gorge had nearly claimed her spirit, but there was one thing it hadn't taken yet: her refusal. She might die, yes, but she would not die curled up in the mud, hidden in a place where no one would find her. If death came, it would be on the move. That thought was enough to make her roll onto her stomach, every nerve shrieking in protest. Her palms pressed into the cold dirt. She dragged herself forward again, toward the far wall. The climb was madness. She knew it. Her arms were shredded, her energy was nearly gone, and the wall above loomed like a giant that had already defeated her once. But she had one weapon left: time. If she didn't move, she was finished anyway. So she moved. She used her elbows and good knee like anchors, inching upward. The broken leg dragged behind, knocking against rock, sending flashes of white pain through her body. Each time she wanted to scream, she bit down on her lip instead, tasting iron. She counted, not in minutes or feet but in grips. One handhold, one breath, one anchor point. She told herself, if I can do 10, I'll stop. But when she reached 10, she pushed for 11. Then 12. She slipped often. Small slides sent her heart racing, dirt cascading beneath her like a promise of death. But each time she clawed back, clutching at roots, jamming her hand into cracks in the stone. At one point, she wedged herself into a shallow indentation, her chest pressed to the wall, her body shaking. She thought about quitting again, about letting herself slide down. But her eyes lifted to the rim, and in that thin slice of sky she thought she saw movement. It might have been a bird, or maybe nothing at all, but in her mind, it was possibility, and possibility was enough. She hauled herself higher. The climb consumed the day, time lost all shape. Her hands blistered and split until they bled freely, red streaks smearing across the stone. Sweat drenched her shirt despite the mountain chill. Her throat was so dry she could no longer swallow without pain. But she climbed. When at last she reached a section where the slope lessened, she dragged herself onto a ledge, sprawling face first against the ground. She sobbed, not from sadness this time, but from the shock of still being alive. For a long while she lay there, her body a ruin, her breath ragged. The sun angled west, shadows deepening. She had made it perhaps halfway. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Her mind, once so consumed by despair, now held a flicker. It wasn't hope yet, not fully, but it was motion, a refusal, a stubborn ember that refused to extinguish. She looked at her hands, at the blood and dirt crusting her fingers, and she thought of her mother again. She thought of Daniel, of his crooked smile, of the way he raised one eyebrow when she contradicted him. She thought of the life she still had waiting, ordinary and fragile, and she clung to it like a rope. "This isn't where it ends," she whispered. The mountain didn't answer. It didn't care. But Madison did, and that was enough. By nightfall she had inched higher still, collapsing finally against a cluster of scrubby bushes that clung stubbornly to the slope. The cold returned, biting, but this time she wrapped her arms around herself with a grim sort of defiance. She was still in hell, but she was climbing out. For the first time since the fall, she believed, even if faintly, that she might not die here. Chapter 16. Storm Night. The Dolomites had been quiet most of the day, the mountains looming like ancient guardians, their jagged spires glowing faintly gold in the late afternoon light. Madison, broken and battered, had pressed forward with her renewed determination, clawing inch by inch toward the vague hope of escape. But as evening drew near, the calm shattered. The sky, once brushed with pink streaks of sunset, began to clot with dark, swollen clouds. At first, Madison thought little of it. She had seen clouds roll across these ridges before. The Dolomites were mountains, after all, and mountains birthed weather from nothing. But as she dragged herself to a small flat shelf of rock to rest, she noticed the smell. Sharp, metallic, like a handful of coins pressed against her tongue. The air tingled against her skin. She glanced up and saw the clouds piling like black anvils, roiling faster than she could track. "No," she whispered, her throat raw. "Not now, not tonight." The storm announced itself in flickers, distant flashes over the peaks, so pale they looked like bones splitting the sky. Then came the sound, low at first, rolling like faraway drums. Madison had little shelter where she was, only a scattering of boulders and sparse alpine grass, a few bent pines growing from cracks in the stone. The trail she had hoped to find still hadn't materialized, and her body could go no farther. Her leg had swollen grotesquely, the skin stretched shiny and taut, every shift of weight sending new daggers through her nerves. She tried to reposition, but agony shot down her spine and through her thigh. She bit her lip until she tasted blood, trying not to scream. She needed cover, any cover. With trembling arms, she dragged herself toward the nearest pine, no taller than she was and twisted from years of wind. Its roots clung stubbornly to stone, providing a scant hollow beneath. She collapsed there, heart hammering, sweat prickling her temples despite the dropping temperature. Then the sky opened. The first bolts forked over the ridges, one striking so close that the mountainside vibrated under her palms. Thunder cracked like cannon fire, echoing through every valley. Rain followed, sudden and furious, each drop cold and sharp. Within seconds, Madison was drenched. Her thin jacket clung to her like a second skin, her jeans sodden and heavy. The water ran down her face and into her eyes. She pressed her cheek into the cold rock, trembling violently. Her body had no warmth left to spare. Wind tore at her, almost playful at first, then vicious. It howled between the peaks, lashing her hair across her face, driving the rain sideways so that it stung like needles. Madison clung to the pine's roots, terrified she would be ripped from her precarious perch and hurled downslope. Her hands, blistered and raw from days of dragging, slipped easily. Each time she lost her grip, panic flared. Lightning illuminated the world in violent snapshots. The jagged silhouette of the peaks, the pale gleam of wet rock, the mist churning like ghostly tides across the mountains. In those flashes, Madison felt more insignificant than ever, a broken speck pressed against a planet that did not notice her struggle. The cold set in quickly. Shivers racked her body, uncontrollable, painful. Her teeth chattered so violently she thought they might chip. She curled tighter beneath the tree, but water seeped everywhere, into her clothes, her bandages, the cracks in her skin. Her leg pulsed with unbearable fire, each throb amplified by the icy rain. She tried to distract herself, to think of warmth, her flat back in London, the old kettle hissing, the wool blanket thrown over her knees. She thought of her mum's voice, gently scolding her for not calling enough. She thought of Daniel's laugh, the way he used to tease her about hiking when she had barely survived a beginner's trail in Wales. "Italy, though," he'd said once. "That's serious terrain." She had laughed him off, and here she was. A jag of lightning split the sky directly above her, the sound following instantly, a sonic boom that seemed to crush the air from her lungs. The tree shuddered. Madison screamed without meaning to, the sound lost in the roar of the storm. Her ears rang long after, leaving her dizzy and disoriented. The hours bled together. Time dissolved in rain and thunder. Her body stopped distinguishing 1 minute from the next. She shivered, then stopped shivering. A worse sign. Her jaw slackened. Her breath shallowed. She knew dimly that this was hypothermia clawing its way in. "Move," she told herself. "Move or die here." She peeled herself from the tree's roots, dragging her body back toward the rocks she'd passed earlier. Every motion was a battle. Her elbows slipped on wet stone, her nails split as she clawed forward. She grunted, moaned, cursed aloud. The rain blinded her. She reached a shallow overhang at last, hardly more than a lip of stone, but enough to shield her face. She collapsed beneath it, shaking so hard she thought her bones would rattle apart. Lightning flared again, and in its glow she saw the blood soaking through her bandages, diluted and pink from the rain. Her leg looked foreign now, no longer part of her. Her hands hovered over it helplessly, as if by not touching it she could pretend it didn't exist. "You won't survive this," a voice in her head whispered. "Not the night, not the storm." Her eyes welled, tears indistinguishable from the rain streaking down her cheeks. She wanted to scream again, but her throat had no strength left. Instead, she pressed her forehead against the cold stone and sobbed silently. But something inside her refused to break completely. The same stubbornness that had carried her down the shortcut trail, the same mule-like determination her brother teased her for, sparked faintly in her chest. She clung to it desperately, even as her body trembled on the edge of collapse. "Stay alive until morning," she told herself. "Just until morning. Someone will come, or you'll find a way. But not here, not like this." The storm raged on, merciless, endless. At some point she lost consciousness. Whether it was sleep or blackout, she couldn't tell. Her dreams were fevered, flashes of home, of laughter, of warmth she no longer had. She woke shuddering, gasping, rain still needling her skin. But dawn was faintly approaching, pale light diffused through thinning clouds. The storm had passed. The mountains were slick, steaming faintly as the sun broke the horizon. Birds called tentatively, as if checking whether the world still existed. Madison blinked at the light, her whole body aching as if she'd been beaten. But she was alive. Against all odds, she had survived the storm night. She lay there a long time, staring at the peaks through blurred vision, each breath shallow but stubborn. The ordeal was far from over, but she had endured another trial, and every trial survived was one step closer to rescue. Chapter 17. The Long Crawl. Morning came with a brittle light, sharp and unyielding. Madison blinked against it, soaked and shivering, her body a raw, uncooperative instrument. The storm had spent itself, but the world it left behind was no kinder. Water ran in rivulets down every slope, turning what had once been her path into slick streams of mud and shattered stone. Rain still clung to her hair and eyelashes, dripped in streams off her chin. Her body ached in every joint, every torn tendon. Her leg, splinted only crudely, throbbed with a steady, insistent pain that seemed to echo through her entire nervous system. She forced herself upright, or as upright as she could manage, which was little more than a crawling crouch, her torso pressed low against the cold, wet rock. Every inch of movement tore new ribbons of agony through her thigh, shooting down to her toes and up into her groin. A harsh pulse of nausea lanced through her stomach. She swallowed it down, pressing forward, hand over hand, until her palms were shredded by grit and stone. The rock's surface was slick with rain, moss, and mud, and each motion was a negotiation with gravity and water. The first half-hour was unremarkable in its terror, a slow, endless series of micro-decisions. Move the left hand first, check the hold, shift the weight slightly, never letting her leg bear more than a fraction of her body. Drag the splinted limb, now swollen and rigid, across slick rock. Pause to breathe, muscles trembling from effort. Her arms screamed, her core quivered, and her fingers had bled through the bandages she'd wrapped over them the night before. She didn't stop. Stopping meant hypothermia, exposure, and fear. By mid-morning, the sun had begun to rise fully, throwing shards of light across the mist that clung stubbornly to the valley floor. The warmth was minimal, but it was enough to dry her eyes and lift the sting of cold that had rooted her to the overhang. She dared a slow scan of her surroundings. The mountain, now glistening and washed of storm debris, revealed a route, but not a safe one. Loose scree tiles like broken teeth stretched down into a ravine. Wet roots protruded unpredictably. Every step forward could mean a catastrophic slip. And yet, forward was all she had. Her stomach growled faintly, reminding her she hadn't eaten in more than 24 hours. Her tiny protein bar, long since consumed, left no sustenance behind. Hunger clawed at her mind, a gnawing, insistent companion that made her muscles feel heavier than they already were. Her throat was dry, her lips cracked, and every breath felt like a rationed commodity. She pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle a groan, feeling the panic rise. She was not lost in imagination. She was lost in reality, and the mountain didn't negotiate. The next hours were a crucible. She slipped repeatedly, small scrapes cutting her arms and torso. Her wet clothes clung and rubbed, turning minor injuries into abrasions that screamed with every motion. Each time she tried to reposition her leg, fresh pain shot through her nervous system. Nausea returned in sharp, rolling waves, almost forcing her to vomit onto the rock. She clamped her jaw, forced herself to swallow the bile, and pressed onward. Around midday, exhaustion became a physical fog. She could not feel her fingertips well, the circulation robbed by cold, wet constriction and effort. Her eyes watered constantly, not from emotion but from the unrelenting wind and rain that lingered in small clouds as the storm dissipated. Every decision, where to place a hand, how to twist her torso, how to prevent her swollen leg from snapping, was a calculation of survival, a microsecond by microsecond choice between life and death. Then came the first real hazard of the morning. A steep patch of scree, loose and slick from rainfall, spanned 15 feet downward into a shadowed hollow. Madison froze above it, heart hammering. The path she had taken yesterday, safe, familiar, or at least passable, was gone. If she went down, one slip could send her tumbling, snapping her leg further, possibly leaving her unconscious and at the mercy of the valley below. If she went back, she would lose ground, exhaust her body further, and risk exposure. She chose the crawl. Her fingers dug into the wet rock, her toes scraped on jagged stones. Inch by inch, she edged downward. The noise of falling water, small rivulets converging into roaring streams, was deafening, almost drowning out her awareness of her own labored breathing. She paused at one point, sitting back on her palms, exhausted beyond recognition. Every movement was agony, but she could not stop. By mid-afternoon, the sun broke through gaps in the clouds intermittently. Patches of warmth hit her wet skin and provided fleeting relief, but they also revealed the reality of her body. Bruises swelling, scratches long and angry across arms and torso, fingernails partially torn, the splint on her leg struggling to maintain stability. Her skin was raw from crawling, each motion rubbing open new abrasions. The swelling in her leg had become grotesque, and even her core strength, a strength she had relied on so heavily, was nearly spent. Dehydration made itself known through a dry, biting taste in her mouth. Her tongue felt thick, saliva was minimal, and her lips chapped. A small rivulet nearby, contaminated with runoff, was all she could see. Drinking it might give her a chance of survival, or it could be a death sentence. Hunger, thirst, and fatigue pressed down together, compressing her ability to reason. She balanced desperation with caution and took only the smallest sips, letting water trickle across her tongue and into her parched throat. Night began to fall again, and with it, the temperature plummeted. The thin layer of sunshine that had dried her hair and clothes was gone, replaced by an early frost creeping across rock and soil. She could hear the distant rush of water, the murmur of trees swaying in the breeze, the wind whispering through the crevices. Her body ached everywhere. She wanted to collapse completely, to let gravity claim her for a while, but she couldn't. The path ahead, though invisible in the dim light, held the only chance of survival. Her hands, blistered and shredded, began to lose sensitivity entirely. She could no longer feel the texture of the rock clearly, only the sudden, painful slips. She had to slow even more, placing her weight carefully, sometimes inching a finger at a time, sometimes resting her forehead against the cold stone for leverage. Every motion cost agony, but each successful inch forward was a minor victory. She counted silently. One hand, the other. One leg dragged, repeat. Breath in, breath out. Inch forward. Hours passed in this manner. Fatigue turned to numbness, and numbness turned to pure terror. Her body, raw from constant friction, began to protest in new ways. Shivering that could not be stopped, spasms in her core muscles, tingling that spread into her toes and fingertips. Her leg, immobilized in the crude splint, had become an alien appendage, swollen to unnatural proportions and hot to the touch. Every shift threatened a worse break. She muttered under her breath, prayers she didn't believe, names of people she loved, fragments of memory. Her mother, her brother, Daniel's laughter. Each thought was a tether, keeping her conscious, keeping her mind from dissolving entirely into despair. She whispered them like mantras, letting the words press against the edges of terror. By the early hours of the next morning, she realized she was on the verge of collapse. Her movements slowed almost to a standstill. She tried to imagine someone seeing her, rescuing her, holding her up. She tried to imagine a warm bed and a real doctor. The vision of hope was fragile, almost laughable in its absurdity, but it was the only thing keeping her moving. A sudden noise made her flinch, a bird taking off from a nearby ledge, its wings slicing the air sharply. Her pulse jumped, reminding her she was alive but barely. She pressed on, hand over hand, dragging herself along the rock, inch by agonizing inch. Each step was a negotiation with gravity, with pain, with the reality that she might fail. The long crawl stretched hours into eternity. Madison had lost track of time completely. The sun rose again in pale light, filtered through the mist of valleys. The Dolomites, harsh and unyielding, held her in a fragile cradle of danger and beauty. She was raw, exhausted, but still inching forward, still breathing, still alive. By the end of the day, she had gained perhaps a few hundred meters, enough to reach a small natural ledge where the slope leveled slightly. Her body protested every inch. Her fingers were shredded, her arms bruised, her leg grotesque in its swelling. Every joint screamed, every breath hurt. But she had made it. Madison pressed her forehead to the rock, tasted blood and rain and sweat in equal measure, and whispered to the mountains, "I am still here." For the first time in hours, or days, she allowed herself a measure of grim satisfaction. She had survived the crawl. She had survived the storm. And although she knew the trials ahead were far from over, she had proven something vital. She could endure. She could keep moving inch by inch, even when every nerve begged her to stop. Somewhere in the distance, the faintest whisper of life reached her. Not people, not yet, but a sound that promised the world was not entirely empty. Footsteps, perhaps, or the bells of grazing animals carried faintly on the wind. Her body shook with relief, exhaustion, and the unholy mixture of hope and terror. The long crawl had brought her here. Pain had been her constant companion. Hunger, thirst, and exhaustion had tested her beyond measure, but she had survived. And tomorrow, she thought, tomorrow she would continue, inch by inch, toward the faint glimmer of life below, toward rescue, toward the world beyond the mountain. Chapter 18. Signs of Hope. The morning air carried a strange, delicate clarity, a brittle promise that seemed almost cruel after the relentless torment of the storm and the long crawl. Madison blinked against the pale sun, each blink a chore, her eyes crusted with the remnants of rain, sweat, and the fine grit of the mountains pressed into her lashes. Her body was a symphony of agony, every muscle screaming, her torn arm stiff and trembling, her swollen leg an unrecognizable appendage, each pulse of pain a reminder of how precarious her survival remained. She paused, pressing her forehead to the damp stone, chest heaving. Her breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, and her stomach clenched with emptiness. She hadn't eaten in nearly 2 full days. Her throat felt raw, and every swallow was an echo of the deprivation she had endured. Yet for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she noticed it, the faintest, almost imperceptible sounds that didn't belong to the mountain. Footsteps, soft, deliberate, human. Her heart leapt and then constricted painfully as adrenaline lanced through her veins. Could it be? Could someone, anyone, really be here? She blinked against the sunlight, straining to make out shapes in the valley below. For hours she had scoured the mist and the jagged rocks with only despair and shadows for company. Now, far in the distance, faint movement traced a path along a shepherd's trail that wound through the foothills. Madison forced herself to focus, trying to gauge the distance, the timing, the likelihood that anyone could see her. Her body screamed in protest as she shifted slightly, testing the limits of her leg. Every motion was agony. She could barely stand, let alone maneuver herself along the cliffside. But the sound persisted, growing a fraction more distinct, a jingle of metal, perhaps bells around animals' necks, echoing faintly through the valley. Shepherds. The realization struck her mind like a thunderclap. The first real sign of civilization, of life, that she had encountered in what felt like endless days of torment. Her heart pounded wildly, threatening to fracture her ribs. Yet, alongside the hope surged terror. Could she make it down in time? Could she drag her shattered body toward them before the shadows of the mountains swallowed her entirely? She began again, slow and methodical, pressing her palms into the damp rock, dragging herself inch by agonizing inch. The climb had taken everything, but now, for the first time, a flicker of purpose guided her. Every inch forward was still a negotiation with pain. Her leg throbbed like molten steel, swelling further with each movement. She had to stop periodically, pressing her face to the rock, whispering mantras to herself, names of loved ones, memories of warmth and safety, tiny fragments of normal life. Each pause was both agony and salvation, giving her the barest moments to summon strength. The shepherd's bells rang again, closer now, and with them, new signs. Footprints in the mud, animal droppings that hinted at movement. Her mind, fogged by fatigue and pain, latched desperately to these indicators, parsing them like a life-or-death map. Someone had walked here recently, meaning a human presence wasn't far. She imagined warmth, food, a doctor, someone who could treat the leg that was now grotesquely swollen, its skin hot and tight, the splint slipping perilously. By midday, Madison had reached a small outcropping that provided a marginal view of the valley below. The shepherd's trail was no longer distant but traceable, snaking down toward a faint cluster of buildings, possibly farmhouses or huts dotting the lower slopes. She allowed herself a shaky smile through the grime and tears. I can make it. I can reach them. But hope was a double-edged sword. The descent required maneuvering across loose scree, wet from previous storms, and navigating jagged rocks that seemed to shift under her weight. Every movement caused spikes of agony. Her arms, trembling and bloodied from days of dragging, threatened to give out entirely. The thought of falling again, worse than before, gnawed at her. Yet she could not stop. The shepherds were her tether to life. She paused at a steep section, evaluating. Using her arms to lower herself inch by inch, she planted her palms and forearms against the rock, then dragged her leg cautiously. Sweat mingled with rain remnants, running into the scratches and bruises that covered her torso. She bit back a groan of frustration as the swelling in her leg made every movement unpredictable. Her bandages, soaked and ineffective, did little to stabilize the joint. Every tiny slip threatened catastrophe. Hours dragged on. The sun began its slow descent, shadows stretching long across the valley floor. Her body ached in ways she had never known possible. Numbness, stiffness, and searing pain intertwined. Her fingertips were shredded, her arms bruised and raw. Her leg pulsed relentlessly, each heartbeat sending fire down to her toes. But the valley below, the shepherd's trail, the faint jingle of bells, kept her tethered to survival. Fatigue warred with determination. Her mind, half sedated by exhaustion, whispered that giving up might be easier, that surrender could free her from the ceaseless pain. But Madison clung to the hope flickering below. Inch by inch, she lowered herself further, every handhold and foothold measured, deliberate, agonizing. Her body was failing, but her mind, sharpened by desperation, calculated each movement with the precision of someone who understood the stakes of a single misstep. Finally, as the sun touched the horizon, casting the mountains in amber and shadow, she reached a small ledge where the slope moderated. From here, the shepherd's trail became unmistakable. Footprints pressed into the soft mud, the faint odor of smoke from distant chimneys carried upward, and the bells rang clear and bright, a song of survival. Madison collapsed against the rock, her body a ruin of exhaustion and pain. She could barely lift her head, but tears came freely, tears of relief, exhaustion, and disbelief. She had survived the storm, the long crawl, the endless mountain torment, and now the faint promise of humanity lay before her. Her mind, though exhausted, could not help but consider the simplest but most profound reality. Help was close. People were near. She was not alone. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to imagine warmth, nourishment, and medical care. She pictured her swollen, battered leg being tended by skilled hands. She imagined dry clothes, a bed, and someone offering the simplest comfort, kindness, acknowledgement, life. Even with every muscle screaming, every nerve raw, she pushed forward. Inch by inch, using the last reserves of her strength, she descended toward the shepherd's trail. The bells guided her, the footprints gave her confidence, and her mind, sharpening with the proximity of rescue, allowed her a fleeting sense of safety. By dusk, she had made it to the edge of a narrow track that ran through a grassy slope. The shepherd's bells rang close enough now that she could hear the rhythm distinctly, a cadence that matched her rapid heartbeat. Her body, a mosaic of pain, exhaustion, and raw nerve, refused further motion for a moment, and she pressed herself against a stone to rest, breathing in ragged gasps. A figure appeared finally, dark against the fading light, carrying the unmistakable presence of life. Someone human. Madison's vision blurred with tears, but hope surged so violently it threatened to overwhelm her pain. She could barely speak, but she whispered hoarsely, "Help, please!" The figure approached cautiously, calling softly, eyes wide as they took in the broken, soaked, and battered hiker sprawled across the trail. Madison's body trembled, every movement agony, but relief coursed through her veins. She had found the first true sign of rescue after nearly 3 days of struggle. Someone who could see her, who could save her. For the first time in days, Madison allowed herself a measure of rest, letting the reality of human contact anchor her. Survival, which had been a series of agonizing inches, was now within reach. The mountains had tested her, the storms had raged, the long crawl had threatened to end her, but she was still here. Still alive. Still moving toward salvation. Chapter 19. The Collapse. The shepherd's trail stretched ahead like a thin, fragile lifeline. Madison's body was a ruin of exhaustion, her swollen leg throbbing with every heartbeat, every movement a fresh agony. Yet, hope coursed through her veins with the intensity of wildfire. Signs of humanity were close. The faint jingle of bells, footprints pressed into muddy earth, and the faint wisp of smoke from a distant hearth. The world below was no longer an abstract dream. It was tangible, reachable, and for the first time in nearly 3 days, survival felt like a real possibility. She lowered herself from the small ledge onto the trail itself, dragging her leg with painstaking care. Each inch required calculation, precision, and resolve. Her arms, blistered and raw, screamed with every motion, her fingertips torn and bleeding. Sweat and rain had combined to leave her skin slippery, making every grasp uncertain. But she pressed forward, a rhythm of desperation guiding her. Hand forward, leg dragged, breathe in, breathe out. The first stretch of trail was deceptive. It seemed gentle at a glance, a wide swath of grass bordered by rocks and pine roots. But the recent storm had turned it into a slick, treacherous passage. Mud clung to her clothes and hair, rainwater carved channels into the trail, and the soft earth threatened to give way beneath her weight. A misstep could mean a fall, possibly fatal after all she had endured. She moved slowly, agonizingly, pausing to rest whenever she felt her arms weakening. Time had lost all meaning. The sun arced across the sky, unnoticed and irrelevant, leaving only the task ahead. Reach help. Hunger clawed at her stomach, a dull, persistent ache. Her throat felt like sandpaper, her tongue stuck to the roof of her mouth. She had not eaten for more than 2 days, and the lack of sustenance gnawed at her muscles and mind, weakening every inch of her resolve. Still, the faint sound of the bells called her onward. The terrain shifted. Rocks jutted from the earth like broken teeth, roots snaked across the path, and small ledges required her to pivot her weight with painstaking care. One false move sent a jolt of agony up her leg, forcing her to pause, panting, tears streaming down her dirt-streaked face. Her mind, fraying at the edges from sleep deprivation and constant pain, occasionally suggested giving up, collapsing, letting the mountain have her. But each time the sound of the bells, the distant hint of smoke, and the possibility of human presence snapped her back. By mid-afternoon, the trail steepened. Her body was failing, her strength a fragile thread. The swollen leg no longer responded predictably. Every attempt to drag it forward elicited sharp, shooting pain that left her gasping. Bruises and abrasions covered her arms, back, and face, bleeding faintly into her sodden clothes. Her hands, shredded from dragging across rocks and roots, felt numb in places and inflamed in others. She could barely feel her fingers, yet she gripped rocks and roots with a stubborn desperation. Fatigue pressed against her in waves. Her eyelids threatened to close even as she moved, her brain fogged with dehydration, hunger, and pain. Each breath felt like inhaling fire. Each inch forward was a negotiation with every muscle, every tendon, every nerve in her body. Her leg throbbed, skin taut and hot, the crude splint struggling to hold what remained of its structure. She paused at a particularly steep section, panting, forehead pressed against a rock to steady herself. Below her, the shepherd's trail wound down toward a small grove, where faint human figures could be glimpsed moving cautiously among the trees. A glimmer of hope surged through her, but the mountain seemed determined to remind her of her fragility. One misstep on the slick earth, and she could fall again, perhaps without the strength to recover. She pressed onward, using her arms to pull, her torso to pivot, her leg dragged with painstaking caution. The descent stretched minutes into hours. She lost count of time entirely, existing in a blur of pain and determination. Hunger and thirst gnawed relentlessly, leaving her body shaking and her mind teetering on the edge of collapse. Yet the distant signs of life, bells, smoke, human movement, kept her tethered to reality, a fragile line between despair and hope. As dusk approached, the trail narrowed. Rocks and roots crowded the path, and the slope became steeper. Madison's arms quivered violently. Each grip was a battle. Her breathing was shallow, chest heaving in desperate gasps. The swollen leg pulsed like molten metal, every movement a negotiation with unbearable pain. She paused, pressed her cheek to a cool rock, and tasted blood, her own, mingled with the rain and dirt. The realization that she was near collapse hit her with full force. "I can't stop," she thought. "Not now. Not when I can see them." Her mind clung to that thought like a lifeline. Inch by inch, hand over hand, she moved. The pain was all-consuming, yet she continued. The world around her seemed to dissolve into an abstract landscape of movement, light, and sound. The jingling bells and faint human figures below her guiding her like beacons through the fog of exhaustion. Then her body betrayed her. Her arms slipped on wet rock, her grip failing. She tumbled forward slightly, landing heavily on her splinted leg. A scream tore from her throat, but the sound was swallowed by the mountains. She lay there trembling, unsure if she could continue. The world tilted, colors blending into a dizzying whirl of gray and green. Nausea rolled through her again, sharp and relentless. Every nerve screamed for relief, every muscle demanded rest. She closed her eyes, fighting tears, fighting the dark seduction of giving up. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time had lost all meaning. But she forced herself upright once more, leaning heavily on a tree root. She tasted blood, sweat, and dirt in her mouth, but also the faint hint of warmth from the valley below. The life she sought. She could see the grove clearly now, the figures moving cautiously, their attention drawn to her ragged form. Her last reserves of strength carried her forward. Pain, exhaustion, and hunger were constant companions, but the promise of rescue, of human contact, of warmth pressed her onward. She crawled, dragged, stumbled, and inched along the final stretch of the shepherd's trail. Her vision blurred with tears, sweat, and the fog of exhaustion, but she continued. Finally, she reached a small clearing. Two figures emerged, wide-eyed, calling out in alarm and concern. Their voices were strange and melodic, Italian, but she understood the intent immediately. Relief surged violently through her chest, threatening to collapse her under its weight. She could barely speak, barely move, but she whispered, "Help, please." Hands reached for her, supporting, lifting, stabilizing. She felt warmth for the first time in days, not just physical warmth but human warmth, the recognition that she had survived, that someone had seen her struggle and was willing to intervene. Her body trembled, every joint screaming, but she was safe, cradled in the arms of people who could guide her to care. They assessed her leg quickly, murmuring words she could not fully comprehend. One of them produced a rope, another a blanket, wrapping her as best they could. She could barely lift her head to nod, but tears streamed freely now, unrestrained, a torrent of exhaustion, relief, and disbelief. She had survived the storm, the crawl, the hunger and thirst, and now salvation was within reach. As they began to move her carefully along the trail, she felt a sense of closure settling over her ragged mind. The mountain, in its indifferent majesty, had tested her beyond comprehension. She had been broken, battered, and abandoned by the elements. Yet inch by excruciating inch, she had endured. She had survived. And now, finally, help had found her. Madison pressed her eyes closed, allowing herself to surrender to the steady hands, the calm voices, the promise of warmth and care. The world was still perilous, still jagged and sharp, but she was alive. Against all odds, she had reached humanity again. Chapter 20. Rescue. The shepherd's hands were steady and warm as they lifted Madison from the rocky trail, careful to support her mangled, swollen leg. Her body trembled uncontrollably, not just from exhaustion but from the raw, unrelenting shock of relief. Every movement sent spasms of pain ricocheting through her entire frame. Her arms, streaked with blood and mud, were quivering beyond control. Sweat, rain, and tears merged into one salty film over her bruised skin. And yet, above all, a fragile, exquisite sense of life's imminence filled her. She had made it this far, and she was no longer alone. The descent toward the shepherds' huts was painfully slow. The humans moving around her were calm, methodical, and unflinching, their voices soft and soothing as they guided her. The trail, which had seemed mercilessly endless during her crawl, now felt almost gentle in comparison to the weight of the ordeal that had brought her to this point. Each step required care. Her leg, grotesquely swollen and wrapped as best as could be managed in a wet cloth, threatened to buckle under the slightest pressure. She gritted her teeth and pressed herself against the ropes, forcing every fiber of her being to cooperate. As they approached the first hut, the smell of wood smoke and warmth hit her like a tidal wave. Her mind, fogged by pain, dehydration, and exhaustion, latched onto it immediately. Warmth, fire, life. She could almost feel her frozen extremities thawing in anticipation. The shepherds moved with practiced precision, lifting her over puddles, keeping her steady across slippery roots, and murmuring reassurances in a melodic Italian she didn't understand, but somehow absorbed fully. Inside the hut, the transformation from cold mountain hell to the warmth of human care was near miraculous. A small fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth seeping into her soaked clothes, drying them slowly against her clammy skin. Blankets were wrapped around her shivering frame. One shepherd, a young woman with steady hands, carefully examined her leg, murmuring words Madison could barely comprehend. She didn't care about the language. The intent was clear. She was no longer alone. She was being cared for. Madison's vision blurred as she pressed herself against the warmth of the blankets, her body rocking gently from tremors. Her mind drifted in that liminal space between consciousness and relief, replaying the last 3 days in fragmented flashes. The fall, the sharp rocks scraping her leg, the terror of the long crawl, the endless nights of biting cold, the relentless hunger, and the sting of dehydration. And yet, interwoven with the trauma, there were moments of pure, indelible triumph. The inches she had gained along the trail, the determination to survive, the small victories over pain and despair. A knock at the door heralded the arrival of a medevac team. They were efficient and calm, moving with practiced urgency. Madison, barely able to comprehend her surroundings, felt herself lifted onto a stretcher. The world became a blur of motion, the rustling of uniforms, the sound of boots on wooden floors, the sharp antiseptic smell that reminded her she was moving closer to safety. Her heart pounded with a mixture of terror and relief. The journey was not over, but now it was guided, controlled, and she was no longer alone. The medevac helicopter landed on a nearby clearing. Madison was secured, immobilized with straps and padding, her leg carefully stabilized. The rotors churned the air, pulling her into a whirlwind of noise and movement. The shepherds waved from below, their faces etched with concern and relief. Madison felt a deep, aching gratitude, the kind that could not be fully articulated. Every breath in the helicopter was a reminder that she had survived the unthinkable, that she was being carried back from death's door into life. As the helicopter lifted, she looked down at the Dolomites, the jagged peaks shimmering in the afternoon light, rivers of melted snow threading through the valleys, and the faint remnants of storm clouds still clinging stubbornly to ridges. They had tested her, scarred her, and pushed her to the brink, but she had endured. Inch by agonizing inch, she had clawed her way back from despair, and now she was being returned to safety, to warmth, to humanity. Hours later, in the hospital, the extent of her injuries became clear. A severely fractured leg, multiple abrasions, minor hypothermia, and dehydration, but she was alive. The doctors moved around her efficiently, speaking in measured tones, treating her with care and precision. Madison allowed herself to relax into their hands, feeling the tremors of adrenaline slowly ebbing, replaced by a weary, profound relief. The room quieted, and for the first time since the fall, Madison closed her eyes. Her mind wandered over the ordeal, the relentless cold, the bone-deep hunger, the nights that had felt endless, the pain that had seemed insurmountable. And yet, interwoven with the trauma were the tiny threads of hope, the sound of bells, the footprints, the distant smoke, the shepherd's cautious eyes, and now, finally, the warmth of human care. She let herself acknowledge it. She had survived. In the hours that followed, she reflected quietly, letting the memories settle into narrative rather than chaos. She had underestimated the mountain, underestimated her own vulnerability, and overestimated her physical limits. Yet, in those moments of sheer terror, she had also discovered reservoirs of resilience she had never known existed. She had fought not for glory, not for adventure, but simply for life. And she had emerged intact. Madison thought of the small decisions, the micro moments of survival that had carried her through, the careful placement of hands and feet, the rationed sips of water, the fragile determination to continue even when her mind whispered surrender. Those moments, though terrifying, had proven something vital. That human endurance is not merely measured in strength or skill, but in persistence, in the willingness to confront suffering and keep moving toward life. Night fell outside her hospital window. She listened to the distant sounds of the Dolomites, wind through the valleys, the quiet rustle of trees, the faint ringing of distant bells. For the first time since the fall, the mountains no longer felt like a threat. They were a testament, a monument to her endurance, a reminder of the fragility and resilience intertwined within life itself. Madison closed her eyes and allowed herself a deep, unhurried breath. She had survived the storm, the fall, the long crawl, the relentless nights, and the consuming pain. She had reached the shepherds, the signs of humanity, and the medevac that had returned her to safety. She was alive. And she would never take that for granted again.
Thanks for listening. Stay cozy, and I'll see you in the next story.